All the same. Winterrose 527. Summary. Myrcella and Sansa were inseparable as children, but had a falling out in their early 20s. Suddenly Myrcella comes back into the lives of the Starks, bringing her 6-year-old daughter and a lot else with her. Robb has a lot of resentment for the way she treated Sansa, but also a lot of residual affection for the woman he's known since she was born. Though he plans to stay out of it, when Myrcella comes to him with a request for her and her daughter, he finds himself unable to say no. The title comes from Cersei's quote, "Love is poison. A sweet poison, yes, but it will kill you all the same." Please note, this is going to deal with some difficult things and at times Myrcella and Robb may not be likable. Please heed that going in. If this story is not for you, please don't read it. I don't need to know why you are choosing not to, you can just simply not. Chapter 1. Chapter text. The sky was a dusky purple, making the trees lining the back road look black and gnarled. It was just past 6, but it was the time of year where everything seemed to change quickly. The sunset, which had previously grown earlier in minutes, now seemed to do so by the hour. The temperatures swung on a heavy pendulum, a baking noontime heat in the middle of chilly mornings and evenings. School had started a few weeks prior, and things seemed to be shifting for the kids more quickly now too. Will, all of 11 years old, had already fallen in and out of love once already, and his 8-year-old brother, JJ, had introduced 3 different kids as his best friend. Throw in a low grade on a science quiz and a lice scare that had successfully ruined a few days for every 3rd grade parent, and he was dragging himself to the weekend along with the kids. Auntie Sansa called you 3 times, Will told him from the seat beside him. You were supposed to be looking at the weather, he reminded him. He had gotten cagey with his phone over the summer, when he'd started to date again. He'd caved on getting the kids an iPad just so they wouldn't ask to use his phone for the games they liked to play. It was unlikely that either of his sons would care very much about the women's names in his calls or texts, but he didn't want to risk it. He wasn't entirely sure why he was being so weird about it. It wasn't that he felt particularly guilty. He and Roslyn had separated when JJ was 5 and had been divorced for 2 years, so he didn't feel like he was jumping the gun. Honestly, he doubted that Will or JJ would even care. Even still, he wasn't eager to have the conversation when it was unlikely that any of these situations would lead to anything more serious. It's always wrong, anyway, JJ said confidently from the back seat. That's what Uncle John says. Will looked over at him and rolled his eyes, and he couldn't help but smirk in return. To JJ, Jon Snow was his hero, his godfather and his favorite uncle all rolled into one. Whatever Jon said was taken as the absolute truth. It was lucky that Jon rarely lied, and he couldn't ask for a better role model for either of his sons. No rain, Will noted. Okay, let's make sure your football stuff is in the car tonight, Robb said to him. Will nodded but didn't say anything. For all of JJ's hero worship of Jon, Will was far more like him. Internal but good to his core, and absolutely never one to show fear. All last spring he had told him that he didn't have to sign up for football, that he could do soccer or music lessons or anything else, but Will wouldn't hear of it. Even though he had seemed to hate it the year before. He had gone through a bit of a growth spurt over the summer and his coach had started to play him more. He was a good blocker just as Jon had been, willing to put his body on the line even at his young age, but even with the success he didn't seem to enjoy it. He would talk to Jon about it. He was nearly as bad as JJ. His brother by marriage, he couldn't have loved him more if he was by blood. They'd grown up together, their friendship the only thing fiercer than their rivalry. He had always relied on him, as had his boys. Not to mention his sister Sansa and their 8-year-old daughter Kitty, his goddaughter and one of the most precious parts of his life. In spite of all that, the person he really wished he could talk to about it was his own father. He couldn't remember if he had loved it at Will's age, or if that came later with the attention and regard. He had been taught from an early age not to be a quitter, but he had learned as an adult that wasn't a good enough reason to hold on to something he was better off letting go of. Auntie Sansa, Will prompted. He could see the turn up ahead to go down Jon and Sansa's drive. If she had needed to cancel, she would have texted him, knowing that for long portions of his day he was unavailable to speak. We'll have to see what she has to say, he noted. Taking the turn down the drive, he turned on his high beams. JJ made an exaggerated woe sound as they went over the gravel drive, and he saw the house lit up, the front porch light on. "Whose car is that?" Will asked. He had parked behind a black Range Rover. "I don't know, but maybe Kitty had a playdate," he suggested. That could have been why Sangza had called, to let him know that she had invited either the child or a friend of hers to come for dinner as well. That usually wouldn't necessitate a call though. Weeknight dinners had always been casual for them. They had gained frequency during his and Rosalind's separation, creating a sense of stability for the boys, a neutral ground that didn't require they be on as good behavior as a restaurant would. Since then though they'd never really tapered off, and while most of them happened at John and Sangza's, he had taken to hosting them as well when he could, or when his niece requested he make her his special salmon. Sometimes other people joined. One of their brothers might come in from the city, or Arya if she was visiting, or a friend of Kitty's and JJ's and one of their parents. Occasionally one of John's colleagues would finagle an invitation and horrify Sangza with the stories he told the kids. They got out of the car, the boys running ahead and opening the door, the sounds of high and dogs barking filling the air. He walked in front of his car and his eyes caught on the crown above the assortment of letters and numbers on the car's license plate, which denoted that it had been issued down south in the Crown Lands. Unlikely then that it was another parent from school. He wondered briefly if Arya had come in for a surprise visit, but if she had she was more likely to road trip in a beat-up old van than a luxury SUV. Following his sons into the house, he saw that lady was sitting in the hall waiting patiently for him. He bent down and stroked her soft head as he closed the door and she fell into step beside him as he walked through the hall and back to the kitchen where he could smell pot roast cooking. John came into the hall as he was heading back there, his eyes slightly wide. For the first time he wondered if the calls actually meant something and he asked, "Are Sangza and Kitty all right?" John nodded and then mouthed something. "What?" John then whispered something. He sighed, "I can't hear you." "On the other hand, we can hear you," Sangza called from the kitchen. He fixed John with a look and then walked towards him. John grabbed his arm as he went to walk by him. "Just be nice," John urged quietly. For a brief moment he wondered if it was Rosalind. As far as he knew, she was back in the Riverlands, but he hadn't heard from her since the summer. He knew that the boys had spoken to her before their first day of school, so he knew that she was at least receiving the texts he had sent to her even if she wasn't replying to them. He couldn't imagine she would show up at Sangza's of all places though, they hadn't even gotten on when he was married to her. He looked in John's eyes and nodded once and then they walked side by side into the kitchen. JJ was up on his knees on one of the chairs at the kitchen island, picking cucumbers out of the salad. Will was on the floor by the breakfast nook, petting Ghost. Sangza was drizzling the pot roast with some of the drippings at the stove. All of these were normal, lovely things. What was neither was the sight of Myrcella Baratheon standing at the counter, slicing into a homemade loaf of bread. "Hi Robbie," Sangza smiled at him with a look of warning in his eye, "you remember Myrcella?" Of course he remembered Myrcella. There was a time in his life where seeing her at a Stark family dinner would have been both normal and lovely. The daughter of his father's former best friend, he had known her since she was born. Though she was the same age as Arya, her and Sangza had always had more in common and had become inseparable in spite of their 2-year age difference. Like John, she had been adopted by his siblings and he could remember swinging her shrieking into the lake, her tiny little limbs shivering as he pulled her out. He could remember the first time she'd whooshed past him on the ski slope, fearless and graceful. She and Sangza had stayed friends in university and even shared an apartment together in King's Landing after Myrcella graduated a year early. In spite of Sangza's best and one-sided efforts, the two of them had fallen out when Sangza had moved back to the north. Or maybe it had been one of the causes of her doing so, he had never been sure. She was pretty cagey on the whole thing. All he knew was that whatever had happened had broken Sangza's heart. Myrcella had broken her heart. And now here she was, slicing a steaming loaf of bread like she'd never left, like she might ask him to test her for her High Valyrian test after dinner if he had time. It had been years since he'd seen her last. Those years had been kind to her. Even in his annoyance at seeing her, he could admit that. She'd been an adorable child, both in her appearance and personality, and though she'd been too young for him, he'd watched her grow into a beauty in their younger years. She was far more beautiful now, though, than she ever had been then. When she turned towards him, though, it wasn't her pink lips or high cheekbones he saw, but the vicious purplish bruise forming around her right eye. She smiled. "Hi Rob. It's nice to see you, it's been ages. Your boys are so big." In his profession he had unfortunately seen many women with such bruises. Often they wore their hair down, to hide behind it, to cover the bruise from the world as though it was something to be ashamed of. As though it was her fault. She wore her golden hair up in a ponytail, as though the bruise wasn't there at all. She had always had a talent for putting on a happy face. He could feel Sangza and John's eyes on him, so he cleared his throat and tried to keep his voice light, unsure of whether the tightness was caused by his anger at her or whoever had hurt her. Likely both. "Mercila, hey," he said. "Will, JJ, say hello." Before his boys could do that, he felt himself grow dizzy at the sight of Kitty coming into the kitchen with a little girl at her heels. How often had he seen Sangza and Mercila come into a room just like that? The daughters looked so like their mothers it was startling. Even more startling, though, was the difference in their natures. Kitty had always reminded him more of Arya than Sangza. Mercila seemed no more similar to her own daughter than she had been to her mother. The little girl with her golden ringlets hurried to her mother's side, hiding behind her. It was understandable, of course, given her youth. She couldn't have been more than 6 and being in a new place, and he only hoped that whoever had hurt her mother had never put his hands on her. "Uncle Rob!" Kitty exclaimed, crossing to him and taking his hand and pulling at it. "Come meet my new friend, Joey. She's 2 years younger than me, just like Mommy and Auntie Mercila." It was unsurprising to him that Sangza would have introduced Mercila as such, though he wasn't sure that she would have ever met his niece. Knowing Sangza, the last decade had been forgiven the moment Mercila showed up, before even seeing the bruise. Whatever his feelings towards Mercila, though, her daughter was a different story. She was innocent and scared, and he didn't want her to feel anything other than welcome and safe. He didn't want to frighten her by taking a step towards her, so he pulled Kitty against him, wrapping his arms around his knees from behind. "Hi Joey, I'm Rob," he offered in the gentle voice he'd practiced over the years. "Those are my sons, Will and JJ. Boys, say hello." "Hi Joey. That's so cool because it's sort of a boy's name, but you're a girl. Auntie Arya would love it, right Uncle John?" JJ offered in a stream of consciousness. "She sure would," Buddy John agreed, his eyes softening and his own voice along with it as he looked at Joey. "Hi," Will offered from his spot on the floor. "Have you met Ghost?" His quiet demeanor was the opposite of JJ and Kitty's nearly aggressive gregariousness. Perhaps that was why Joey looked up at Mercila, a question in her eyes. Mercila smiled at her in such a way that made his heart clench, and he had to look away as she stroked her daughter's cheek gently. It seemed to be the encouragement Joey needed, because she turned to Will and shook her head. "He'll like you because you're quiet like me," Will told her, "and him." "He's right, sweetheart," Sangza told Joey, stepping behind her and carefully placing her hand to the little girl's head, stroking her hair softly. As though she knew that Sangza was already someone she could trust, Joey released Mercila and walked across the kitchen floor. "If you hold your hand out like this," Will suggested, holding out his own close to Ghost rather than Joey, "he'll sniff you." Joey did as he said and then proclaimed, "It tickles." "Yeah." Will's eyes crinkled, "but you can sit down and pet him now. It's always good to let them sniff you first." "Why?" Joey asked. She sat on the floor though, tucking her legs underneath her, letting Ghost remain in between her and Will. "Animals are kind of like us," Will told her, "they just don't want to get hurt." Joey looked very solemnly at Ghost and stroked a hand over his head. "I wouldn't ever hurt you." Ghost licked her cheek and a whisper of a smile overtook her face. Will stroked Ghost's back. "He believes you," Will told her with a small smile. He had realized earlier on as a parent that sometimes he could be having an entirely normal day, in a not-so-great week, and one of his children would do something that would make him so overcome with pride and love that it would make him feel ashamed for feeling like any moment with them was anything less than remarkable. This was one of those. When he and Mercila were Will and Joey's ages, he couldn't remember giving her this much notice, and he had known her for her entire life. Will had only met Joey, and while it wasn't in his nature to be rude, he rarely made an effort with strangers. Unlike his younger brother, he'd had the same best friend since preschool. There was no reason in the world for him to act this way with Joey, except for the most obvious one: she needed him to. Mercila never had. That bruise suggested that she might now. He looked at her again, to see that her and Sangza were sharing a look, shaking their heads slightly in that way women sometimes did that suggested they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. He remembered that look from his own childhood, riding in the back of his parents' car, one of his siblings falling asleep on him. His father would have caught sight of them in the rearview mirror and nudged his mother, who would have turned around and done exactly that. Though he'd been a dad for 11 years, he had never quite grown used to the way he found him and John and Sangza taking up their parents' roles. More often than not though they did, so for a few minutes the adults all focused on getting dinner on the dining room table. He squeezed Will's shoulder as they all went in, arranging themselves at the table. He had no idea what to say or to ask Myrcella. He had no idea what was an appropriate topic with her or not, and that made him feel awkward with everyone. Though he knew that it shouldn't, this made him resent her a little bit more, that she had disrupted the ease that not only his kids but he had grown to rely on. It was a bad sign when John was the more welcoming of the two. "Would you like some wine?" he asked her, holding up a bottle. "None for me, thank you John," she returned. John sat back down, holding the bottle as though he didn't quite know what to do with it. Sometimes they had some with dinner during the week but just as often they didn't, and he suspected that John now felt strange pouring it for anyone else, just as he felt awkward speaking to anyone else with her sitting there. John set the bottle down on the table without offering it to him or Sangza. "Joey, what do you like to eat?" Sangza asked. Joey was sitting in between her and Myrcella, directly across from him. "How about some pot roast?" He could tell instantly that Joey did not want to eat the pot roast, just as he felt somehow sure that she would not say so. Before Sangza could put some on her plate, Myrcella picked up the salad and suggested, "Let's start her off with this." "And how about some potatoes, baby? And some yummy roast carrots?" Joey nodded and Sangza scooped some carrots and potatoes onto her plate as Myrcella helped her to the salad. When they were done they started to pass the platters to everyone else, not bothering to put any food on their own plates. He glanced again at John, but he was cutting some meat for Kitty. It took him a moment to realize that Myrcella was offering him the salad, and he thanked her stiffly before plopping some on Will and JJ's plate without bothering to ask if they wanted it. Neither of them would, particularly, but they both knew they had to eat it if they wanted whatever their Auntie Sangza had made for dessert. Mommy Kitty started, spearing 4 bite-sized bits of pot roast onto her fork as though to spite John for the trouble he'd taken cutting it up for her. She was 8 years old and had opinions about being treated like a baby. He glanced at John who was too distracted making his own plate to notice the sass and Kitty went on, "How long are Joey and Auntie Myrcella staying with us?" "Until Halloween." "Joey, what are you going to be?" "I'm going to be James Bond," JJ announced. Typically he would reprimand him for interrupting an ongoing conversation, but in truth it seemed a mercy to Joey even if he hadn't intended it to be. Myrcella laughed a soft laugh from across the table. "That's a wonderful costume. I have a gun and everything," JJ told her proudly, a broad smile on his face. He was so like him, unable to resist a bit of praise when it came from a pretty face. Joey's fork clattered to the floor as she looked at JJ in horror. "It's just a toy, honey," he told her without thinking. She glanced at him and he contorted his face into an exaggerated one of disbelief. "It doesn't even squirt water." Joey's eyes widened and then the most innocent giggle he'd ever heard left her mouth. He felt Myrcella's eyes on him but by the time he looked at her she was already up, picking Joey's fork off the ground and handing her daughter her own before going back into the kitchen to get another one. When she returned they all tried to have a normal conversation, but it was strained and bumbling. One of them would use a shorthand and then feel the need to explain the context to Myrcella, which ended up making the actual story seem far more important than it was. Amusing anecdotes became so long-winded that the punchline was weakened by its surroundings. "Why haven't you been here before?" JJ asked Joey when they were all nearly finished. Myrcella answered for her, "Because we've been living in King's Landing." He never quite turned off the lawyer part of his brain, the part that had been trained to snag upon the wording of things. "We've been living in as opposed to where from." The devil was always ever in the details. "What happened to your eye, Auntie Myrcella?" Kitty asked her. "Oh." Myrcella laughed in a self-deprecating, painful sort of way, making his stomach twist. "I was so excited to pack to come up here, that when I was pulling my suitcase out of the closet it fell right on my face." It was a better lie than saying she had walked into a door, and he couldn't help but wonder if she'd had to use it before. A suitcase wouldn't have done that. Will followed his line of thought. Ursula turned to him, her voice light but her eyes flashing. Didn't your dad ever tell you it was rude to call a lady a liar? Will, so like his Uncle John, was not one to back down. No, but he taught me it was rude to lie. Before he could interject, Ursula smiled. Sounds like him. What about eating dessert? What is your dad's opinion on that? Big fan. JJ nodded, still shoveling pot roast into his mouth. Everyone laughed, except for Joey. Ursula stroked her daughter's hair before getting up to go back to the kitchen. When she was gone, he watched as Joey tapped on Sangsa's arm. Sangsa turned to look at her, a smile on her face, and Joey beckoned her closer. Gamely, Sangsa lowered her ear to her, and Joey whispered into it. He watched as the color drained from his sister's face. She pulled away, and rather than force the lightness he knew she was capable of into her tone, she told Joey with a solemn firmness, that shouldn't have happened, and it will never again. I pinky swear. While Sangsa had likely known as well as he that no suitcase had fallen onto Ursula's face, she clearly had just become aware that Joey knew it, too. Sangsa held up her pinky, which he'd seen her do 1,000 times over the years with Ursula. Joey raised her pinky immediately, seemingly well practiced in such vows, but hesitated before hooking it through Sangsa's. I've known Sangsa her whole life, honey, he offered, and Joey turned to look at him. She's never broken a pinky promise. For some reason he felt relieved when Joey hooked her pinky around Sangsa's, as though Sangsa and Ursula were right and there was some sort of ancient power behind it, as though it really was unbreakable and everlasting. As though it was strong enough to guard a frightened little girl, and her mother as well. Chapter 2. Summary. Thank you all so much for reading and commenting on this story. It's definitely different than my others, but I'm enjoying writing it. I think that the entire fic will be from Rob's POV, but I'm not entirely sure. TW, mentions of past abuse. Chapter text. I understand, but that's not what was agreed, he repeated for what felt like the 100th time. His client tried to explain his point of view once again, and he'd had enough, so he said, look, if you want me to pursue this I will, but that is not what we agreed, so I will have to go back to them, and doing so at this point when we are this close to signing may get their backs up and they will use it as an opportunity to leverage some things you care more about. This was his least favorite part of the process. At the end, when people could see their marriage finally completely dissolving, they became small-minded and petty, deciding that actually they cared greatly for vacation homes they'd complained of all year round and gifts that had been so ugly they'd been stored in the attic until the giver of them had come to stay. His client started and then sighed, no. No, she can have them. He sat silent for a moment, not wanting to rush him lest he get his back up once again. No one ever wanted to hear the truth, that the richest embroideries were the hardest to unwind. That how difficult this had been was a testament to the life he'd had with his wife, not a recanting of it. By this time there was so much hate and vitriol that so many forgot that it had once been a union of love, that the easiest divorces were those where marriages had been lightly entered. No one wanted to hear that, though, because no one wanted to be reminded of a love that had been withered and mudded and ruined by time. So he kept his silence for another moment and then said, I think that's the right decision. I'll send you a note after I speak with opposing counsel, but I think we are nearly there. His client thanked him, though he'd just wasted a billable hour. It was either him or his therapist, though, and like a therapist he would say if asked that this was all a part of the process. He checked his personal phone. He had a missed call from Bran, who he'd call back on his way to a meeting that afternoon. He also had a few text messages, from Theon, John, and Cecily, one of the women he'd gone out with recently. He opened hers first. You still owe me an ice cream. He wasn't sure why he cringed at that. Maybe because it was the sort of thing Kitty would say to him. That wasn't necessarily fair though, because it was sort of an inside joke as much as you could have an inside joke with someone you'd met twice, and could have just been a result that he felt weird that she was 26. Or maybe he should feel weird that she was 26. That was 12 years younger than him, their age gap was a year older than Will. Did that make him creepy? He wasn't entirely sure. It wasn't as though he'd been hunting for young flesh, she'd actually approached him. And it wasn't like she was some giggling schoolgirl or something, she had a big job at the mayor's office. Not that someone had to have, for fuck's sake. He didn't know the right thing to say or think anymore. When he'd met Roslyn, everything had been easy. They'd both been 20-somethings fresh out of college, there was a party, she was a friend of a friend. Drunken hookups turned to sober hookups which turned into an actual date or two, and then suddenly she was his girlfriend and they'd been dating for a year and a half and she was showing him engagement rings that she liked. Easier wasn't always better. He texted Cecily back 2 scoops next Wednesday. Not wanting to dwell on that any further, he went next to John's text message. He was just opening it when there was a knock on the door. "Come in," he called. His assistant Lewis was blushing. He'd given him the job as a favor to his uncle Ed Muir, who was good friends with his much older brother, and for the most part he was doing well. However, he hadn't yet fully gained full control of himself, and so occasionally lost the plot when there were mix-ups. There's a, Lewis shook his head, smoothing his tie. He gulped. "There's a woman here who doesn't have an appointment but she says she knows you and..." "What's her name?" he asked. Lewis' eyes widened, and though he was now fully holding back laughter, because how the fuck did he not get her name? "You didn't get her name?" Lewis looked behind him and then shut the door, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry," he said. "She's got..." He gulped once again, "blonde hair and really pretty green eyes, but one has a purple bruise around it," he would guess. No wonder Lewis was in such a state. The first time he'd met Sangza he'd nearly passed out. He looked at the open text message from John on his phone. "Incoming. Be nice." Of course John had tried to warn him. Of course Sangza hadn't. He smoothed his tie and stood up, grabbing his suit jacket off the chair and going to put it on, and then thinking better of it and leaving it hanging over the back. "You can let her in," he told Lewis, "and you may want to push my 12:30. "Yes sir," Lewis agreed. "Should I get her some coffee?" He looked at him. "Does she want any?" Lewis cringed. "Please don't make me ask her." He chuckled in spite of his annoyance and nodded, making a vaguely gesturing notion that had Lewis opening the door and saying something that made her appear a moment later. He was the one who swallowed hard now, but it wasn't because she was beautiful, it was because of her bruise. It was darker now than it had been the night before, or maybe it just looked glaring against her skin in the grey early afternoon light. "Marcella, this is Lewis. Lewis, this is Marcella," he introduced them. "Coffee," Lewis all but shouted at her. It would have been well within her rights to flinch at the strange man in front of her, but she merely shook her head. "None for me, thank you." "And maybe no more for you today," he suggested to Lewis, who nodded and then opened his mouth to say something and then just walked out of the room. He came back a moment later and shut the door, and then it was just him and Marcella. She stood there, close to the door, and said, "I'm sorry to come by unannounced." "You should be," he said with more bite than he had intended, so he softened it by suggesting, "You nearly killed Lewis." She smiled and rolled her eyes. "He'll survive." "Are you in the middle of something?" "Just my job," he thought snidely, which wasn't exactly fair considering he hadn't actually been doing it when she came in. "It's fine," he said instead, gesturing to the chair across from his at his desk. "Have a seat." She stepped forward to do just that, unbuttoning a pale grey wool coat. "Is that Sangza's?" She pulled it off and hung it over the chair, smoothing it before sitting down. "It is," she confirmed. "I had forgotten how cold the north is." His eyes locked onto hers and she held his gaze for a moment. He felt his stomach twisting in annoyance. He was annoyed because she was right. He had been cold to her. He was being cold to her. Here she was, a woman he'd known since she was born, clearly in some kind of trouble, and he couldn't find it in himself to just be nice to her. He had been up half the night punishing himself for how he'd been with her, wondering about the specifics of what had led her to his sister's door, thinking he ought to book a flight to King's Landing to murder Gadri Faring. Gadri Faring. He'd not given much thought to Marcella's choice of husband when he'd heard of it. He'd known Sangza had never liked him. She had never understood why someone who had been raised with the Lannisters, with Joffrey, could fall for someone who she considered arrogant and snide. He'd remembered thinking ungenerously at the time that the fact that the guy was a self-made millionaire 100 times over might have added to his appeal, because by that point he'd been less inclined to think well of Marcella. His whole family had been invited to their wedding, but he hadn't gone. Things had been bad with Roslyn by then, and going to a lavish wedding would have only rubbed salt on the wound. Sangza had been a bridesmaid, and come back feeling terrible about the baby weight she claimed to still have, obviously having been made to feel inferior by the models and socialites that made up the rest of Myrsilla's bridal party. And that was the other reason he was annoyed, because there was quite a bit of time between when he'd last seen her and now, and the fact that she was now in trouble didn't just erase that. Well, thank God for Sansa then, he noted. I do thank God for her, she told him. She held his gaze for another moment, and then, as he'd seen her do with Will the night before, her demeanor changed and she smiled. Your boys are charming. He smirked. That's one word for them. I'm sorry about Will. She shook her head. Please don't apologize for him. What he did with Joey, that's a pure heart he's got. There was no praise like the praise for one of his children. He had grown tired of praise and accolades for himself after some time, but he was glutton when it came to his children, which he knew, really, was at least partially self-serving. He wanted to have proof that they were good kids, and he knew that some of that was wanting confirmation that he was a good parent. They were perfect to him, but he knew they weren't perfect. He knew that no one was. Even still, insofar as a perfect heart was an attainable thing, he was glad to know that she had seen it in Will. Her whose heart had been pure once too. Cheese, he tried to think of a word to describe Joey. Adorable, he might have said, sweet, innocent, petrified. The reason I'm here, Myrcilla finished for him when he could not choose an appropriate adjective for the little girl that had haunted his sleepless night. In my office or in the north, he wondered. Both, she answered, running her fingers through her golden hair. He nodded and jutted his chin towards her swollen eye. Has he done that before? My suitcase, she tried to tease. He hated the twist in his stomach. The sound of her making light of what had happened. The rage it summoned in him. Myrcilla, he said, his voice harsher than she deserved. She swallowed and looked down at her lap briefly before looking up at him. He has never hit me before. There have been other instances where he has been rough. Rough, he repeated. She shook her head. He'd grip my arms too tight, or shove me. Once it was a worse but different. He had sat in this chair as women broke down detailing far worse treatment. He had let them cry, and spoken in calm tones about what they were going to do. He had told them that it wasn't their fault, that they couldn't change the past, but that he'd do whatever he could to make sure that they were set up for their future. He had felt anger in the passive way he always felt when someone was hurt who didn't deserve it. He had not tasted blood in his mouth, as he did now. But when he did this, you decided to leave him, he guessed. She shook her head. No, he did this because I told him I was leaving him. It was a notable distinction, but he could tell the weight it held her. He could hear it in her voice. That she had decided to leave him before he had done this. That she was not merely reacting. That she was in control of the decision, maybe. He collected this little bit of her, another thread in her tapestry that he'd not yet quite worked out the image of. Has he ever hurt Joey? He had to ask. If he'd ever laid a finger on her, I'd be in a King's Landing prison cell right now, she told him. In that moment, she had all the ferocity he remembered in her mother. In his own, too. Fair enough, he agreed. And then thought about it. But you're here. For her. Are you afraid he'll come after you? I would have thought with your family in King's Landing. I'm here because of them just as much as him, she told him. She shook her head. I'm usually better at explaining myself, but I'm finding it difficult with you. I know that you're angry with me, and I think I understand why, but can you please just set that aside for a moment, because my daughter is blameless in all of it. He thought of the way Sansa's face had drained the night before when Joey whispered in her ear. He thought of the way Joey had looked into the eyes of a dog 3 times her size and promised not to hurt him. He thought of the way she'd looked at him like maybe she wanted to trust him. Of course, he agreed. Thank you, she said, and to his horror he watched tears fill her eyes. I'm sorry. He pushed a box of tissues towards her and she took one and held it in her hands as a tear fell from her eye. Thank you. To answer your question, yes, I am concerned that he will come after me. John called one of his friends at the police station and they came to the house yesterday afternoon and took my statement and some pictures and helped me file a restraining order. Your other question, about why I didn't go to my family, is a little bit more complicated. She stopped and he told her, take your time. I know them a little, of course, so I can imagine. But I know they love you. She nodded. They do love me. And they love Joey. But they love their pride and ambition more. Now, it's true that their pride would likely not stand for Gadri doing this, that they would back me with a team of lawyers against him. God knows my grandfather has enough on retainer. But instead you're here, in my relatively small practice, he led her. Small but successful, she reasoned. This was not an overnight decision. I've done my research on you for some time. Your track record is impeccable. And I trust you. He shifted in his chair, discomfited because he thought he was somewhat immune to personal praise. It's been a long time, he protested for some reason. Her eyes leveled upon his. And have you changed so much? What was he supposed to say to that? No, I'm not trustworthy. Of course, he couldn't say that. Even if you have, I trust you far more than I trust my family's lawyers. Yes, they would back me. They know how to win. They will make him rue the day he ever thought to start his own company. The prenuptial agreement secured my assets, not his. His arrogance left him wide open, and they have never failed to find the soft underbelly even when it's better hidden. I'm not sure I understand, Mercila, he admitted. I get though that you'd maybe favor expedience over other possible gains. As you suggest, I imagine you are already well provided for. She nodded, but as I said at the beginning, I'm here for Joey. My family's lawyers know how to win, they will do anything to win. It wasn't often that he thought of his own divorce when he sat in this chair, but he did now. And your version of victory isn't the same as theirs, he realized. Another tear fell out of her eye as she smiled. See. I knew I could trust you to understand. He nodded. So tell me what victory looks like to you. She took a deep breath. I want sole custody, and I want only supervised visitation with him. He exhaled audibly. That is going to be difficult if there was not physical violence against Joey. Yes, she agreed, but you're very good. He smirked. I'm not saying I won't try, I'm just telling you that is going to be a difficult sell to a judge. He's going to throw everything he can at you, and while I understand that getting her and yourself out and away from him was the most important thing, his team will lean on the fact that you've taken her away from her school, her father, her home. She stood up and started walking around his office. She had done this ever since she was a girl. He remembered testing her for an exam, and it felt as though he had to walk around the house holding flashcards. He had seen her family members do it too. It was a way of disarming, making your eyes follow them around the room, immediately put them in a position of power. He had done it himself a few times, but it had never come as naturally as it did to her. Hers had always seemed a bit like a fidget though, unaware of the power she possessed. Her school and her father, she said, almost to herself. Gadri is a vain man. He had one success and no one had ever bothered to explain that success breeds itself. With one success under your belt, others trust you to have another and so therefore give you the resources necessary to achieve it. Once you have enough success under your belt, who is there to tell you that it was not all your own doing? That you were not destined to have it because of some sort of preternatural ability? And a man who can take such credit for the work of others could never see his offspring as anything other than extension of himself. So Joey had to be gifted too. She's a bright girl, I don't deny it. I'm her mother, no one needs to tell me how special she is. But she is 6 years old. He put her into this preschool that, you ask me if he's ever physically harmed her. No, not exactly. I was washing her up before dinner one night, and I looked at her hands. She had dug her fingernails into her palms so deeply that she bled. After I put her to bed I told Gadri that the school she was in was too intense, that she was far too stressed, that they were putting too much pressure. He wouldn't hear it. When I told him what she'd done to herself, do you know what he told me? So cut her nails then. For fuck's sake, he all but whimpered. If they want to throw at me that I took her away from her school and her father, let them, she told him, and as for her home, I'm it. He picked up a pen off his desk and flipped his pad of paper over to a clean sheet. All right, let's get started, he suggested. She stopped walking and turned to look at him. You'll do it. You'll help me. Her eyes had widened, a look of hope on her face that reminded him of the girl he'd once known. Which made it easy to tease, so surprised, and here I thought you trusted me. Chapter 3. Summary. Thanks to all those who are reading and commenting on this story. I'm definitely trying something a little different here. I'm trying not to spoon feed information, but I am giving the necessary information. I hope you all can trust me to tell this story the way I want to tell it. Also a huge thank you to Sansa Clarks who read through this and answered my insane questions about it. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. It was a perfect day for a football game. The sky was a clear blue and the sun beat down, tempered by the cool breeze. The pads did not look so silly on Will this year. He had eaten enough over the summer that his growth spurt had not left him gangly like it had to some of the other boys. There was a solidness to him that belied his 11 years, reminding him of pictures he'd seen of his uncle Brandon at this age. Even still, no matter how much he looked the part, there was no excitement on his face as he had gotten ready. He hadn't gotten to talk to John the other night about it, with everything else going on, but he'd tried to talk to Will about it yesterday when they sat at JJ's soccer game. Will wouldn't hear anything about quitting, though, and he realized he might have to table the discussion until the end of the season and focus his energy on letting him off the hook for next year. Will was more popular on the field than he was in school, a cluster of boys around him as they warmed up. He couldn't help but be proud of him, not because of his talent but because of his respect for his coach, the way he didn't goof off with the other boys even though they were kids and this was supposed to be fun. He could still remember shoving Theon when they'd had to run laps because Theon wouldn't shut up when the coach was talking. JJ raced ahead of him, wearing Will's old practice t-shirt from last season. It was way too big for him, but he didn't care, already looking towards when he'd get to play. Grey Wind caught sight of Will on the field and started slightly for him when he ran closer to retrieve a ball. He held his leash tight but that didn't stop Grey Wind from barking at Will to get his attention. Will looked up, and smiled for the first time since arriving, calling "I'll see you after, boy." He ran back to the team and Grey Wind did the small little whimper he got sometimes when the boys were in opposite directions and he wasn't sure who to herd first. Rob leaned down and stroked his ears, walking him closer to JJ. Though there were bleachers, JJ liked to stand at the sidelines, close to the action. There were other parents and siblings who waved to him as he walked past the stands. "You ought to get out there and show 'em how it's done," John Umber called, eliciting a guffaw and some cheers from some of the parents who were around his age. "A good way to strain my back and my pride," he called back with more humor than he felt. There were worse ways to be remembered than as a great football player, but he had no desire to be 17 again, to live in the past. He had no desire to sit there and reminisce and have the guy slap him on the back saying he should have gone pro. That wasn't the life he'd wanted. He was living the life he wanted for the most part, but every so often the great expectations people had of him made him feel small now. It shouldn't, because it was his choice, all of it, but it did. "Uncle John!" JJ shouted. He turned just in time to catch Kitty as she launched herself at him. He let out an OOF which, though it sounded similar, was less dramatized than when she was younger. The closer he got to 40, the more he felt the roughhousing with the kids, waking up the next day and having to place why something pulled or twisted when he moved. "Hi." Kitty greeted him, kissing his cheek. Then pulled away slightly. "Look." On her cheek Sansa had used some face paint to write the number 23 on it. "Think Will'll like it." He was sure Will wouldn't care much, but he'd give his little cousin a hug and tell her he did, so he said, "I think he'll love it." "Look at those sparkles, weird your mom didn't save any for me." "Oh, it's in the car," Sansa warned. He scrunched his nose at Kitty and she did the same, giggling and shaking her head. Then she looked down and her face immediately went to one of annoyance. "Mommy," she scolded, "look." The object of her ire was Grey Wind, which was a bit odd because other than when he'd bitten the nose off her favorite stuffed animal when she was 3, the two of them got on well. "Kitty, don't speak to your mom that way," John scolded right back, as he lifted JJ up with one of his arms as his son held on with both hands. He was relieved to see that John also seemed to struggle more with this than he once had. Kitty rolled her eyes and he fixed her with a look. He was fine to be the naughty uncle when it came to sweets before dinner and letting her stay up late when she slept over, but he, John and Sansa had a firm truce not to let their kids be brats. "She said Lady and Ghost couldn't come," Kitty explained with a slight pout, "and now they are at home. Sleeping on the fancy couch they aren't allowed on," probably he interrupted, not such a terrible Sunday afternoon. Kitty giggled and whispered, "Ghost loves that couch." He chuckled, "I know." He set Kitty down and she scratched underneath Grey Wind's chin, which caused him to tilt his head back as though he was going to howl. It was then he saw the other little girl, holding Songza's hand. He fought the urge to crouch down so that he was at eye level with her, knowing that if he did, JJ or Kitty or Grey Wind would probably tackle him backwards, and not necessarily wanting to treat her like a baby in front of them. It was strange that she was only 2 years younger than them. He remembered Ursula being little for her age, but he couldn't remember her being this diminutive. Maybe, though, that was because she'd always been more comfortable than Joey seemed to be, doing twirls in their foyer in her dance leotard as Songza helped her, the chaos of him and his other siblings and their friends going on all around her. John and Theon could have run by her at full speed and she wouldn't have flinched. "Hey Songza," John, he greeted them and then compromised by tilting his head down and waving, "Hi Joey." She waved back, her other hand still in Songza's, "Hi Rob." He was a bit surprised that she remembered his name, and he knelt down under the guise of petting Grey Wind. "Will's going to be so flattered you came to see him play." She smiled and looked up at Songza questioningly, and he watched as Songza swiped her nose with a smile. That seemed to give Joey the confidence to ask, "Where is he?" He turned and looked and spotted him. "Oh, if you come this way you can see him," he suggested without looking at her. To his surprise she came to his side, they were eye to eye and she peered around him. He pointed, "Right down there, see? He looks so much bigger," she mused, taking a small step back when 2 boys from the other team ran past. "Those are his pads, he wears them to keep himself safe," he told her, turning to look at her and teasing, "Makes him look kind of silly though, don't they?" She smiled and nodded, but then her gaze went to him and her eyes went a little wider, saying, "He only needs them when he's playing." This time he didn't shy away from looking directly at her, and he promised he'd never need them anywhere else. As though to make him seem like a liar, Grey Wind took notice of them. His eyes had been firmly on Will before, and he nudged into him, nearly pushing him over. "This is Grey Wind," he told Joey. "He's a brother of Ghost and Lady, but a bit less well behaved. He's just as sweet though." His heart clenched as he watched Joey hold her hand out for Grey Wind to sniff as Will had taught her. Grey Wind had other ideas though, and bent his head so that her hand landed on top of him and then moved forward, making her pet him as he chose to sniff her cheek and then her neck and then into her hair instead. "Grey Wind," he chuckled, holding him by the chest. Joey giggled. "I won't giggle giggle giggle, oh." That came in response to Grey Wind licking her from jaw to hairline. Joey's golden hair fell over his arm as she gave up trying to greet Grey Wind with any sense of decorum and hugged him instead. Grey Wind sat down, his broad chest acting as a support for her as she stroked his head and back. "Just let me know if he bugs you, okay, honey," he said. "He won't," she smiled widely, her eyes closing as she nuzzled into his fur. "Will I annoy him?" "Only if you stop," he chuckled, standing up. He watched as Grey Wind laid down on the ground, his body in between Joey and the field. JJ and Kitty were playing tag, and though JJ kept looking at Joey curiously, Kitty didn't invite her to play. "No Ursula?" he asked Songza and John as he joined them. "She's looking for a place to sublet," Songza told him. He nodded and then wondered, "Sublet?" Songza and John shared a look, and it was John who told him, "Think she doesn't want to jinx it." Right, he realized. They were going to file for divorce in the north, which meant any proceedings would happen there. His first hurdle would be getting a judge to temporarily grant Ursula sole custody during the negotiations and possible trial, which could take months. They had a good chance of it. That custody was often granted to the mother, and the restraining order and proof of abusive behavior by Gadri would help. Regardless, the idea of permanent sole custody with supervised visitation was going to be difficult, and it wouldn't be practical to have Ursula and Gadri living in entirely different places. He knew from experience that didn't work out. So it made sense that Ursula would look for somewhere temporary. He knew that was the case. There was sound logic in it. Even still, it grated on him. What was the point of coming back into Songza's life just to prepare to leave it again? Why put her through that? He could understand why she wanted a lawyer not connected to her family. She was probably right. Gadri was a gold mine, and they would likely push for some of the cars or the homes or 100 other things that she didn't care about, because they were trained and skilled at that. The nuances of a custody battle were a different thing, and he doubted the fate of one little girl would matter much to them when they thought of the other upsides. Her family had always placed more value in actual capital than that of the human variety. Even still, there were a number of other lawyers she could have gone to. It didn't have to be him. He glanced at his sister, Sangza. Sangza sniffed and shook her head. She signed Joey up for school though. Didn't she, sweetheart? Sangza asked Joey, while making it clear to him that in spite of Joey's silence she could still hear every word they were saying. Are you excited for your first day? Joey nodded, but he wanted to get back down on his knees and check her palms, because he didn't quite believe her to tell them if she wasn't. She reads at a 4th grade level, Sangza told him quietly. They wanted her to skip a grade, maybe even 2, but Marcella wouldn't hear of it. You don't think that will? They may try, but no, he assured her, his eyes on Joey, and said, a normal, 1st grade classroom is exactly where she ought to be. But if she's not being challenged, Sangza suggested. The ref blew the whistle and the teams started lining up. He clapped his hands. Let's go, boys. Then said to Sangza, she's 6 years old. Not everything needs to be a challenge. I wasn't saying that, Sangza told him, her jaw locking. I was only asking. I know, he sighed, sorry. The truth was that though he was sure Joey was bright, just like Marcella said, her reading at that level was likely due to the rigor of her prior school. While he was not one for stymieing potential, it also wasn't fair to ask her to keep pushing herself to an uncomfortable degree. Not to mention the fact that while her reading comprehension might surpass that of her classmates, it didn't seem that socially she was there yet. Putting her with kids older than her wouldn't necessarily help her catch up in that regard. In fact, it might only ostracize her further. From a practical perspective too, it made his job easier. He could hardly argue that Gadri was putting unnatural pressure on her if Marcella signed her up for something similar. Support, stability and sensitivity. That was what he was going to argue Marcella could provide that Gadri couldn't. She was proving his case for him. She shook her head. It's fine. I'm just. He turned to look at her more fully and he saw her lip wobble a bit before she took a deep breath. I'm just afraid to ask her the wrong question. Just like that, he got off Marcella's team real quick. He couldn't imagine what it was like for Sangza, having her oldest friend back after all this time, having her and her daughter in her home. A decade of silence and hurt between them. Feeling like she couldn't ask questions she had every right to for fear of pushing Marcella away. He wrapped his arm around Sangza's shoulder, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. She recovered quickly, and called out, "I will," even though he was nowhere near to needing to do anything. John glanced at her. I'm going to ask the kids if they want something to drink from the concession stand. What is our opinion on soda? No, he and Sangza said in tandem. But hot chocolate. Obviously, he agreed. Sangza smirked and said, fine, or apple cider. John went to go ask Kitty and JJ. Since it was his idea, he got to be the hero, and immediately the kids were jumping around him, offering to go with him to help pick things out. While Kitty was trying to convince Sangza that she ought to be allowed to have chips too, John went over to Joey. He watched as he knelt down, and put his hand to her back gently. Joey startled, which made him flinch. There was no one safer than John. She looked up at him though, and Rob watched as the color returned to her cheeks when she realized who it was. Do you want something to drink, sweetheart? John asked her. Nothing for me, John, she smiled shyly, thank you though. John's eyes crinkled at her, and he pet Greywind's head. What do you think of my friend here? He's a very good boy, Joey determined, and then urged, feel his ears. John stroked Greywind's ears, and Greywind groaned and hooked his paw over John's arm to keep him there. Very soft, John determined. Joey watched Greywind nuzzle John and smiled softly, her eyes going from Greywind to John's hand to John's face. John, she asked. He looked at her and she said, could I maybe have some water actually? Of course. Do you want to come along and see if there's anything else you want? He asked. He tried to focus on the field, but he heard the intake of Sangza's breath. He felt his eyes smart as Joey tried to calculate what the right thing to do was. She seemed to want to trust John so badly, but couldn't quite seem to do it naturally. We could bring Greywind with us, John suggested, a smart move considering how much more comfortable Joey seemed in the company of the dogs. Joey turned towards him, Rob. Is it okay if we take Grey Wind on a little walk? I'll bring him right back. Yeah, honey, of course he agreed. Make John get me some hot chocolate though, okay? She giggled, and glanced at John, who sighed dramatically but nodded, okay. John stood up and held out his hand to Joey. To his surprise, she placed hers in it and let him pull her up. Grey Wind stood up when she did, but she picked up his leash anyway. Rob? Sangza asked after a couple of minutes. He looked over at her and saw that while her eyes were on the field, her gaze was steely. Make him pay. He swallowed, and though he might have told her all the concerns he'd told Myrcella, he couldn't bring himself to. Instead he promised her, and himself, and Joey, even though she was well out of earshot, he's going to lose her forever. I hope it kills him. It won't, Sangza sighed. He was about to say something else to her when he saw Will go to tackle someone, but another boy on the opposite team went to tackle him at the same time. His heart seized as he saw Will go down, and the ref was blowing the whistle and the game was stopping. He ran out onto the field, towards where Will was still lying there. He got there before the coaches and the other parents. Will, baby, are you okay? He asked, kneeling down. Will nodded, wincing. I just got the wind knocked out of me. Okay, just take a minute, he urged. Let me see you move your legs. Dad. Will rolled his eyes. He grinned in relief. If he felt well enough to roll his eyes, then he really was fine. Come on, he poked him gently, a little jig. Will chuckled and then winced again. Ouch. His coach got there and knelt down. How you doing, Will? Good, Coach, Will said, his voice a bit deeper than it was when he was speaking to him. I'm sorry. You'll get him next time, the coach said. He got him this time, he noted. His coach looked at him, clearly prepared to square off as he had to with so many parents complaining about their kids not getting the right positions or enough playing time, so he explained, it was a clean tackle. He wasn't one of those parents that often sided with his child over the teacher or coach. He wanted authority figures to be respected, and part of teaching that was respecting them himself. But it couldn't be absolute anymore, and he wasn't going to have an 11-year-old boy beating himself up for getting tackled in a game. I should have been paying more attention, Will determined. His coach looked between them and then smiled down at Will. Not to worry, Stark. He was in your blind spot is all. Let's get you up, he said, offering his hand to Will. Will took it and he pulled him up, watching the way he walked it off. He heard people clapping on the sidelines, and he looked around to see that the other boys were okay. Why doesn't he call it for today, he suggested to the coach. The coach averted his eyes and clapped Will on the arm. What do you say, 23? I can play, Will determined. Will, he urged. He wished his coach wasn't standing right there. He wished Sangza had come with him. She would have smacked the coach upside the head for leaving it to Will. She would have made Will more comfortable saying that he was done for the day. This was the other side of respecting a coach. The part where you pushed yourself harder than you ought to, because you were taught to be dependable. There's no I in team was something he had been taught since he was young enough to grip a ball, and he believed in it. He believed that it was important to feel a sense of responsibility to people other than yourself, but it shouldn't come at the expense of yourself. Will looked at him. I can play, Dad. It was a point of pride now for him, that much was clear, so there was very little to do except tap him gently on the helmet and say, then go get him. He headed back towards the sidelines and his coach fell into step beside him. On the sidelines he could see the kids huddled with Sangza and John and Grey Wind, waiting to see what was going to happen. Tough kid you got there, his coach said. Right at that moment he caught sight of Joey's worried face, holding a cup of hot chocolate for him in both hands. Remember that, he urged the coach. The other man glanced at him and he clarified, the fact that he's just a kid. They all are. No worse than it was for us, the coach suggested to his back. Yeah, he agreed, turning to look at him briefly. I was always taught we were supposed to do better. He headed back to the sidelines and he watched as the parents of the other two boys went back as well. One little boy had decided to call it seemed, the other was remaining in the game. He looked at the father with the boy who was heading for the sidelines. He looked ashamed. Is Will okay? Kitty asked. He's all right, kitten, he promised, ruffling JJ's hair. Sangza and John glanced at him and he shook his head and then felt a little hand on his forearm. He looked down and saw Joey holding up the cup of hot chocolate. "Thank you, honey," he took it from her. "Did Grey Wind behave?" She nodded and the whistle for the game blew. He opened his hot chocolate and fixed his eyes on the field. Or more precisely, on Will. As Will got closer to the fray, he felt that little hand take hold of his. He looked down at Joey and she looked up at him, promising, "He'll be okay. He's got his pads, right?" Notes. Would love to hear from you if you're enjoying this. Chapter 4. Summary. Hi all. Thanks to those of you who are commenting, it's so lovely to hear from those enjoying this. This is a really fun / interesting one for me to write. Being a slower burn between Rob and Ursula, it's giving me the opportunity to explore the other relationships in the fic more. I hope you're enjoying that. Chapter text. After the game, they all went back to Sangza and John's house. Will's team had won easily, and Sangza had made him show her there weren't any bruises before sending him up to her bathroom to take a shower. When he'd come down he'd been barefooted and pink-cheeked, nearly as tall as his aunt as he rested against her, asking for tastes of what she was making for dinner. Sangza gave him a spoon and let him scoop out the remnants of the pot of mashed potatoes, stroking his hair, lady at their feet. He left the two of them to talk, hoping that Sangza would reiterate what he'd been saying to him in a way that he'd be more receptive to. Though he tried, the boys would both be more vulnerable with Sangza than they would with him. In many ways she was the mother figure they knew best. The other kids were all well occupied. Kitty and JJ were in the backyard running around, and he found Joey in the living room with John. He was on his phone, likely answering work emails, and Joey was on the floor reading Anne of Green Gables. Her back was against Ghost's belly. Grey Wind seemed to be nosing at the book every so often to get her attention. He offered John one of the beers he'd brought in and sat down on the part of the couch closest to him. "Thought you were going to get into it with the coach today," John suggested as he put his phone away. He sighed, cracking his beer. "He's a bit of a dick." Instead of simply chastising him for using it in front of her, John asked, "Joey, did you teach him that word?" Joey giggled, holding up her book. "They don't use that word in Anne of Green Gables." Maybe Rob should read it then," John mused, "work on his vocabulary." Joey smiled, tucking it closer to her, still open, and promised him, "You can read it after me." He chuckled, "Sounds good, honey. Will it bother you if we're talking while you're trying to read?" She looked between him and John, and he could see her little mind doing those calculations of hers, and then she shook her head, petting Grey Wind and Ghost. "No, I like your company." As soon as she turned back to the book, John looked at him and pumped his fist. He tried not to laugh, but he understood. It was like being initiated into a special club. He had been floored when he felt Joey's hand slip into his at the game, and so touched. She was such a sweet child, her nature was so pure. The only thing to do had been to smile at her and say "Yeah, that's right," and hold on to her hand until she let go of his. She'd held it all the way until half-time. He couldn't help but wonder if Gardry had ever held her hand, if he took it when they were crossing the street, or when she was scared. He doubted it very much. "What's your problem with the coach? Seems to know what he's doing. Takes that whistle of his a little seriously though," John noted. "I don't know, I don't even know that my problem is him. I just think about when we were kids," he tried to explain. "Did we even enjoy it?" John's eyes narrowed at him slightly, his mouth opening to give an immediate answer, but then he stopped and took a sip of beer. He shrugged. "I did. I mean, honestly, a part of me I think just wanted to hit something that wouldn't get me into trouble. But it was more than that, I guess. I mean, I had your dad, but otherwise coach was kind of that guy for me. And the team gave me some structure." "Yeah," he nodded, "because that was fair enough." He and John came from different circumstances in that regard. He'd never lacked for structure in spite of the chaos of his house. Lionel had raised John on her own and wasn't able to be around as much as she wanted to be during the week, more than making up for it on weekends. Sort of like him. He was good about being home by 6, but there were hours after school that the boys were with their nanny. He was all theirs on the weekend, but he often wondered if it wasn't enough. Look, I think there was a lot to it at the time that maybe we didn't realize was pretty toxic, right? John asked. "What does Will say?" He says he doesn't want to quit, he told him, but there's a long way between that and wanting to play, isn't there? Before John could answer, Grey Wind was standing up and running towards the front door, only to return a moment later, his front paws lifting slightly off the floor trying to get Myrsilla's attention. He couldn't tell if she was wearing makeup or if her bruise had faded well, but she looked better than when she'd come to his office, like maybe she'd gotten a couple nights of sleep. She started to unbutton her coat and only then did he realize that Joey had been wearing a little jacket at the game, while the other kids had run around in t-shirts. Southern girls. Hi baby, she smiled at Joey, then looked down at Grey Wind who was trying to get her attention. Yes, hello to you too. That's Grey Wind, Mommy, Joey told her, he's so nice. He is. Myrcilla pet Grey Wind's head, all but cooing, aren't you sweet? She waved at him and John, hey guys, and then went and sat on the floor. Joey closed her book and wrapped her arms around Myrcilla's neck, burying her face in it. Myrcilla kissed her hair and hugged her back. Oh, I needed this. Did you have fun? She smiled when Joey nodded. You did. That's great. She glanced at him and John and then said to Joey, why don't we go get ourselves ready, give Rob and John some privacy. That's okay, he said, we like her company. He was worried for a moment that given how he'd been treating her that was going to come out like we like her company and not Myrcilla's, which wasn't how he meant it to sound. Joey giggled though and turned to him with a grin on her face. Though Myrcilla didn't understand the joke, she clearly understood that her daughter was smiling and laughing in the company of men, and it brought a smile to her face too. John asked Myrcilla, where are you off to? Myrcilla looked at Joey briefly and then told him, I thought we'd give you all a little space. He glanced between her and John, who seemed to be trying to figure out how to say something. They hadn't talked about that either, Myrcilla being back. She'd been as much a part of John's younger years as his own, since they were both always in and out of their house. As far as he remembered it, he'd always had a soft spot for her. They all had, though. He wondered if John was trying to figure out if Myrcilla was trying to give them space or get some for herself, like he was. All John said though was, I think Sansa was planning on you guys being here. Myrcilla clearly didn't need anything further, understanding his meaning well enough by the slight tone, and set a smile on her face. Oh, great then. As though that had been her hope all along. She turned to Joey, I'm going to go see if Auntie Sansa needs any help with dinner, okay? Do you want to come with me or keep reading? I want to come with you, Joey told her. Oh, I was hoping you'd say that. Myrcilla hopped up, holding out her hands to Joey, you can tell me all about your day. Okay, Joey agreed. He couldn't help but smile at the two of them, and he thought of what Myrcilla had said about her being Joey's home. He believed it. With her there was no calculation, no hesitation, preparing at once to tell her the story of her afternoon, so you know how you left right before lunchtime. Myrcilla nodded thoughtfully as she and Joey walked by. She mouthed to John thank you and he nodded at her. She turned to him, likely to do the same, and he was preparing to wave her off when Joey plopped Anne of Green Gables into his lap. Myrcilla smirked but didn't say anything else as they walked off. He pointed his thumb back at her and asked John, did she just sass me? John chuckled, I think she did. He took a sip of beer, his eyes crinkling, you know what pisses me off? That it pisses me off that she likes you better than me. He chuckled, she does not. She does, John told him with an annoyed grin. Frustrating as all hell. But for fuck's sake, what an angel. Their eyes met briefly and then they each raised their beer to clink against one another's before taking a sip. That's what his dad had always called Myrcilla growing up. He wasn't sure he ever heard him call her by her name. How's it been here, he wondered, his throat thick. John looked around and then leaned in closer, the white winds are blowing. What, he asked. It had been a gorgeous day. I'm speaking in code, John told him. Doesn't saying that sort of defeat the purpose of speaking in code, he wondered. Rob, I swear to God, John warned. He chuckled, because John looked genuinely exasperated. Okay. The white winds are blowing. Like, winter, wind, yoo-hoo, a storm is coming. You're worried a fight is brewing. Nailed it. Excellent deductive reasoning, but your subtlety isn't really there yet, John noted sarcastically. Well, you're not exactly giving key insights either, he pointed out. It was obvious to anyone that it was only a matter of time. John looked around again. The way he acted, one might think Sangza had bugged the lamp. Though in his defense, there had been an incident with a baby monitor when Kitty was a newborn, and Sangza had overheard John saying something about how she'd knit a psychotic amount of baby blankets which hadn't gone over very well. Seemingly satisfied, John went on, "It's hard. I think they are both really struggling under an overwhelming amount of niceness. Sangza's going crazy because Myrcella does everything before she has a chance to. And I think it's like it's nice that Myrcella is trying to be helpful, but it was the same thing as Myrcella trying to give them space. Objectively thoughtful, but painful nonetheless. But that just makes it clear how uncomfortable she feels being a guest here," he suggested. "Yeah, it's like she feels like she has to earn her keep or something, which she obviously doesn't. And it just sucks for Sangza because obviously growing up Myrcella basically lived at your house, and it kind of just makes her feel further away from her even though they are under the same roof," John noted. "Maybe not for that long," he suggested. "Yeah, John agreed warily. He turned to look at him and John shook his head. "Look man, whatever happened between them, Myrcella and Joey can live here for the rest of their lives as far as I'm concerned. I'm not all that crazy about them moving out if I'm being honest with you." "Gadri," he guessed. "Yeah, I mean, do you think a guy like that is going to be held back from a restraining order?" "I'd much rather have me and Ghost in between him and them," John noted. He couldn't argue, since he'd been thinking of that too. The idea of Myrcella and Joey in a house on their own made him pretty uncomfortable, knowing the limited amount that he knew. It wasn't as though he thought they should live with John and Sangza forever, particularly not with things being so strained, but he felt better knowing that they were here. At the very least, a man around might make Gadri think twice. He seemed like that kind of guy. It wasn't so much that he thought Gadri would come with the express desire of hurting Myrcella. In fact, if it followed a normal pattern of behavior, he'd actually be pretty obsequious to her at the start. The trouble was, he seemed to have such an arrogance to him, and an inability to see things from someone else's point of view. Likely if he came up here to get her back, it wouldn't have entered his mind that she might say no. He would have convinced himself that the only reason she'd stayed away was because he hadn't presented her with the option, because he hadn't apologized and done what he'd needed to do to make her dance to his tune. If Myrcella said no, his behavior would change quickly. He didn't want to think about it. The only thing he wanted to think about less was the possibility of her saying yes. "Yeah," he nodded. "Trouble is, they are making it worse on themselves," John noted. "Neither of them are going to say anything because we're all in a house together, but by not saying anything it just makes it awkward being in a house together. Maybe me and you should go somewhere else for dinner," he suggested. John chuckled. "Yeah, maybe. It's too late for Will and Joey, but we can probably sneak Kitty and JJ round the side." He grinned and then he saw Joey come back into the room. "Auntie Sangza has asked that you please come to the table," she told them. "She didn't say please, did she?" John asked her. Joey shook her head, trying not to smile, and then looked at them pointedly. "I have to go tell Kitty and JJ." The way she said it suggested she didn't entirely trust them to get to the table left to their own devices. "You're very thorough," he grinned, standing up. "Excellent form." John stood up too, but too slow. "I'm going to tell them first and I'm not going to say please." With that he ran off towards the backyard, Ghost trailing after him. Joey's eyes widened and she looked at him. He smirked. "I bet you can still catch him." She wanted to so badly, it broke his heart. He goaded, "Go on." She gave him a grin and then turned on her heel and ran out of the room. He went the opposite way and headed into the kitchen to see if he could bring anything in, but the only thing still in there was a salad which Myrcella seemed to still be seasoning. It was too late to head into the dining room, because she looked up at him and smiled. "Hey," she said and then grabbed a fork. "Will you taste this and tell me what it needs?" "My true gift in the kitchen," he joked, and she smirked. He took the fork from her and stabbed some lettuce. The dressing wasn't one he recognized, but it was delicious. Nothing. It's really good." She smiled. "Couldn't have done it without you." He chuckled, setting his beer down and picking out a cucumber and popping it in his mouth. "How did today go?" She winced. "Not great. But I have more appointments tomorrow." "How was the game?" "They won," he told her. She nodded, looking at him. "Joey said Will did really well." First game she's ever seen, but I take her word for it. Yeah, real eye for talent, that one, he nodded back. They looked at each other and her giggle was covered with his laugh. Sangza came back into the kitchen and looked between them, a smile arriving half a moment too late for him to miss the look of hurt that had crossed her face. His stomach clenched, feeling disloyal, though he knew Sangza would never begrudge him it. Only wish it for herself. Her and Myrcella had used to spend hours giggling. Sometimes someone else would say something random at the dinner table and it would set them off, the pair of them clutching their sides. His mom would try to tell them to control themselves, but it wouldn't have much teeth when she was starting to laugh just at the sound of it. His dad would be no help at all, egging them on. Once he'd been in the front seat of his dad's car, Sangza and Myrcella in the back. He'd gone to turn on the radio, and his dad had slapped his hand. "Who needs music?" he'd asked. He hadn't really understood it until he'd been driving JJ and Kitty back from swim lessons when they were younger, Sangza in the front seat. The kids had been cracking each other up in their car seats, him and Sangza not daring to say a word for fear of ruining it. Myrcella picked up the salad. "I'll just bring this in." Then, as though she'd seen the look too, she teased to Sangza, "Before this barbarian picks it clean." Sangza smiled. "If you have enough hands, try and keep Will from the mashed potatoes. It runs in the family." Myrcella pretended to breathe deeply. "Wish me luck, I'm going in." They were both trying so hard, it was physically painful. He waited for the door to close behind Myrcella to look at Sangza. "Will seem okay?" he asked her, starting on easier territory. She smiled. "A real one, he's so funny." "Will?" he asked. Then shrugged. "Well, you did marry John, so I guess humor is subjective." She laughed. "They both have a dry wit that simply eludes barbarians such as yourself." That was as close as she'd ever get to a chastisement. None of them deserved her. "It's okay to be mad at her," he told her quietly as she fiddled with things that didn't need fiddling. She didn't look at him, picking at something on her immaculate countertop, and reasoned, "I'm still mad at Arya for reading my diary in the 7th grade, doesn't mean I wouldn't do anything for her." He chuckled. No, it doesn't. But if I remember correctly, you confronted Arya about that, unless Pretteen Screeching lives in my nightmares for a different reason." Sangza laughed, but then it drained from her and she shook her head. "It's funny, I used to blame all that distance for us not talking. But now we're under the same roof and the silence is so much louder." He put his hand on her shoulder and pulled her to him, wrapping his arms around her neck, his chin resting on top of her head. After a moment he felt her arms wrap around his waist, taking a deep breath. "Is that an example of that famous dry wit?" he asked her. And they both pretended the sound she made against his chest was a laugh, even when it soaked through his shirt. Chapter 5. Summary. I'm so nervous and excited for this chapter. I hope people are still enjoying this story. A huge thank you to Sempelit Love and Sangza Clarks for reading through parts of this and letting me screech at them. Chapter text. It felt strange to be in the house in the middle of the morning on a weekday. Often he didn't return to the house after dropping the boys off at school, using the early hour he got to the office to justify leaving it at a reasonable one. If the boys were sick, he would work from home in the office he had on the ground floor, but otherwise he preferred to go into his one downtown. There was nothing that meant he had to, nearly everything was electronic these days, but he found that he liked the separation. That both he and the boys knew that when he was here it was their time, not to be interrupted by calls and his ever-renewing inbox. He never had clients to his home, not once in the 13 years he'd been practicing. Not until today. He had considered asking Myrcella to come to the office. He had some things for her to sign and wanted to walk her through the overall process and what things would look like in the short term. She had come to their meeting last week with a list of questions, and he had only realized later that meant she had felt in her heart of hearts that he would take the case on. Sangza and John would have promised her that he would, whatever her superficial surprise. This wasn't a conversation that he wanted to have with her in the office though. He had considered asking her to meet him for coffee, but that didn't seem right either. So here he was, for the first time in his career, with a client's papers on his kitchen counter, dressed in a grey Henley and jeans, rather than the shirt and tie he'd normally be wearing at this hour. His gaze went to the clock, hoping to see it was after 10, prepared to be annoyed by her lateness, but it was only 9:53. He'd answered emails when he'd gotten back from dropping the boys off, but had felt foolish for not just asking Ursula to follow him from the school. He'd seen her in the front seat of Sangs's car, the pair of them waving to him. JJ had run to catch up with his cousin, where she was walking up the front steps hand in hand with Joey, whose backpack was larger than she was. Grey Wind's ears perked and then his whole body rose, barking and drowning out the sounds of Ursula knocking. He went to the front door and opened it, finding her looking at him with a chagrined expression. "Hi, sorry, I know I'm OOF." "Hello Grey Wind," she laughed, petting him with both hands. His dog had failed to read the room and curled himself underneath the table across Ursula's feet at dinner on Sunday night, though his head rested on Joey's. "Grey Wind, come on," he sighed, pulling him back by the chest. "You're sorry?" He asked it from his lowered position, looking up at her and her gaze caught on his. She seemed to shrink ever so slightly and he felt guilt take hold again. She released him of it though, smiling slightly. "I'm a little early. Still getting used to the lack of traffic around here." "Oh," he straightened up, "that's fine, come on in." As though she were adapting, she didn't wear a coat today, just a chunky turtleneck sweater that looked to be of a soft material, the sleeves spilling halfway down her hands. "Your house is beautiful," she told him as he closed the door. "Do the boys climb that tree out front?" "No, I have to sometimes to get the cat down though," he said. "You have a cat?" she wondered. He turned to look at her. "No, but there is one that really likes that tree." She laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls of the foyer. "Or just likes to torture you?" He smirked. "Sounds like a cat." She smiled a soft smile, and he noticed the birthmark underneath her eye. He could see it now that the bruise was healing. She saw him looking and he cleared his throat, gesturing to it. "Your face looks good." He then felt hot blood in his ears and clarified, "Better." "Thank you," she said, and though she didn't laugh he could hear the echoes of it in her voice. He cleared his throat once again. "Let's go into the kitchen." "Are you getting sick?" she wondered, following along. He looked at her to see if she was teasing him, but her face was earnest so he lied and said, "Hay fever maybe." They went into the kitchen and he tried not to watch her looking around. He did though, annoyed by the small, placid, close-lipped smile that gave away nothing as she took in the countertops and breakfast nook, drifting over the needlessly high-quality appliances. "Coffee?" he asked. "None for me, thank you, Rob," she said automatically. The same way she'd said no to wine from John, the same way Joey had said no to something to drink before she'd realized it was alright to ask. "It's already made," he noted, "and I even have that gross vanilla syrup for when Sangza comes over." She laughed, tempting, "But really I'm okay. I've had too many cups already this morning." He nodded and then went to get some for himself since he went through the trouble of making it before realizing that he'd also had too much this morning. So instead he rested his hands on the counter, blowing out some air and gesturing to the seat at the island for her to take. She placed her bag down on the floor and sat down, adopting the look of a prized pupil awaiting the lesson of the day. "How is Joey's first week going?" he wondered. She looked surprised by the question but then smiled. "I'd say it's going really well. It's really different, which is good, and her teacher seems lovely." She didn't know what to do with herself afterwards though. "No homework?" He shook his head in annoyance. Last year the school had introduced the concept of homework to JJ, when he was in 2nd grade. It wasn't every night and it wasn't rigorous, but it had been to teach them how to do assignments out of school. Other than that it had just been summer reading. Joey was only in 1st grade, and it sounded from the way Ursula said it like she'd had homework for as long as she could remember. Kitty let her help her with hers though Ursula went on with a small smile. "Very good at delegating, that one." He chuckled. "Time is money, you know." Then he asked, because he couldn't really tell, "How are they doing together?" Ursula opened her mouth to answer and then paused for a moment before saying, "Good, for the most part. I think it's a little tough for Kitty, because she sort of looks at it like a live-in playdate, and she's so sweet and good at sharing and." Ursula, he stopped her, because he couldn't quite take more of the backbends her and Sangza were doing to not be in the least bit critical, or honest. "I love Kitty more than my own life, but when she spends a weekend here the kids are in bed by 8 so that I can be in bed by 8. She laughed in surprise and he shrugged. "I'm sure it's overwhelming for Joey." "It is, but that's not all down to Kitty either," Ursula noted. "She is, well, she has some room to grow when it comes to socializing. She doesn't need to, she will never be Kitty, and that's okay, but she needs to learn. I just think it will be easier when there is some separation. For everyone, he commented. How is it going finding a place? He watched as color rose on her cheeks, and he wondered if she thought he was speaking to her on behalf of Sangza. Nudging her out of his sister's door, since Sangza would clearly never do it herself. If so, she wasn't entirely wrong. It's going fine, she offered in a forced light tone. I'm choosing between two places right now. Both have their merits. He nodded. Would you take either of them if you weren't so desperate to get out of Sangza's? Her eyes flashed in anger. I'm incredibly grateful to Sangza. And John for that matter. He held up his hands. I don't doubt that you are. But gratitude along with everything else has to be sort of grating. Her jaw set and he went on, and anyway I think you should come stay here. In the guest house. She stared at him for a moment. He couldn't be sure what she was thinking, but he was pretty sure the word idiot had crossed her mind at least once. She opened her lips to speak and then shook her head. Finally she said, may I have some coffee, please? He was grateful for something to do with his hands. With a task he didn't feel the need to fill the silence, and he had to turn away from her so he couldn't see the emotions and questions running over her face. Do you want the gross vanilla syrup? He asked. Definitely, she answered. He couldn't help but smirk at the cabinet, and then he shook out of it, grabbing 2 large mugs and the syrup and then pouring them both steaming cups. He went to the fridge and grabbed milk, showing it to her, and she nodded, and then he brought it all over to her. She smirked as he poured some of the vanilla syrup into his own cup and he shrugged. When they'd both made their coffees he took a sip and watched her once again. She held the mug in both hands but didn't drink it. He finally started to say, at the exact moment she decided to start speaking. Why would you offer me your guest house? She asked. Then before he could give any of his reasons, she said, I know that you're mad at me. No one is using it, he said. That's not a reason to offer it to me, she told him. Seriously, Rob. He sighed, okay, honestly. She nodded. I want you the hell out of Sangza's house. The two of you living together in the state that you're in isn't good for anyone, and she will never tell you to leave, won't even entertain the idea that she might want you to leave, and we all know it. So I want you out of there. I know she'd never kick me out, Ursula said softly, her eyes on the counter. That's why I've been looking for a place. I mean, I've found 2, either of which would be fine. What's their security like? He asked. Her eyes flashed to his. Those gates outside look pretty decorative to me. He's not. He nodded towards Grey Wind, who admittedly looked pretty toothless curled up on his dog bed in the sunshine. I'm not. Ursula shook her head. I've asked you to defend me in court, nowhere else. It's not your job to protect me. You sound like a brat, he chastised her. She looked at him for a moment and then sighed, setting her mug down on the counter and rubbing her hands against her face. I know. He hadn't prepared for her agreement. So, he started. She shook her head. No. Thank you. I'm very grateful for the offer and the sentiment behind it, all of them really, but no. Why not? He asked. Because then I'd be in the same position I'm now, just with a little more space, she told him. He started to disagree, but she shook her head and gestured towards him. You're so mad at me. He shook his head. It's not the same. It is to me, she told him gently. She swallowed and shook her head. And it's really noble of you to put that aside, but I can't stay here knowing how you feel about me. You're already doing me favor enough by representing me. That's not a favor, you're paying me, he noted, and then tried to ease the tension by joking. We did cover that, didn't we? She smiled, closing her eyes briefly. The favor is you agreeing to do it. Well, then you can repay me by agreeing to this, he challenged. Her eyes flicked to his and he laid his cards down on the table. When you asked me to represent you, you asked me to put my personal feelings about you aside and think of Joey. Now I'm asking you to do the same. She rolled her eyes. Well, that was annoyingly persuasive. I hope you're this good in court. He chuckled. No, I prefer to use my best tactics in my personal life. Rob, she sighed, her voice was hollow. I can't even consider it until you just tell me everything you want to say to me. I can't keep going like this. It is so awkward to be awkward with you, and I know you're holding your tongue to keep the peace, but are you any happier for it? He took a sip of his coffee and then placed his mug down on the table. Some of it's not mine to say. It is if you're feeling it, she argued. I know that the way I handled things with Sangza upset. But you didn't handle things with Sangza, he interrupted, his anger boiling at the slightest permission. She held his gaze but made no indication of preparing to defend herself. All right, you want to know. She nodded. You broke Sangza's heart. Sangza. Your best friend in the world. Your sister in every way that matters. She would have done anything for you and you pushed her away. He shook his head. I mean, what? Did you grow apart? Have a fight? That's fine, that happens between friends. God knows it's happened a time or two with me and Theon and John, but we found our way through it and you didn't even try. She laughed joylessly at that. Look Rob, say whatever you want to say to me about how I treated Sangza, but don't throw you, Theon and John in my face. He held his hands up. Why? How is different? She smirked. How often do you talk to Theon? Really talk to him? He shrugged. I don't know, we had a beer last week, I'll probably see him over the weekend. And when you do, will it be awkward? She asked. Awkward, he wondered. Why would it be awkward? Her eyes widened. Because it'll have been nearly 2 weeks since you saw him last, and it doesn't sound like you've been texting much. No. She didn't wait for him to confirm one way or the other, though the truth was no. Other than a few errant texts, it wasn't like they were messaging a ton. Do you know how odd it would be for me and Sangza to go 2 weeks without seeing each other with only a handful of texts in between? Do you know how it would be to go even a day without speaking in one way or another? The awkwardness and the tension that would come from that. He winced. So what you're saying, she smothered you? No, she argued as though he was an idiot. I'm saying that you have no idea what it takes for 2 women to maintain a friendship. How intertwined your lives are and how pulling even one thread of that causes the entire thing to distort. He had been thinking of marriages similarly just the other day, so it was hard to argue against. And he could see her point. Though Sangza had never had a friend as close as Myrcella since, he was constantly floored over hearing her speak to her friends. The questions they asked one another. The details they knew of each other's lives. It took him and John 3 separate occasions to have one conversation. Fair enough, he conceded. So what, something pulled and you just couldn't figure out how to handle it? He knew that this part wasn't really his business. But he wanted to know. He couldn't reconcile the girl he'd known with the one who had done that, and this version of Myrcella sitting in front of him was somehow a product of them both. She thought on it for a few moments. Me and Sangza were living together in King's Landing. And I was in sort of a weird place. You know, I'd graduated university early but for no real reason except that I could. Our group of friends were split between people hustling and those coasting, and for the first time in my life I found myself in the latter group. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't have any direction, really. It was like all my life I'd heard how much potential I had, and I never thought to ask before then, potential for what? Annoyingly, he understood that. When he was in university, there was talks of him playing football professionally. Everything he'd done since middle school had been towards that goal, and hadn't been until the moment that he got in spitting distance of reaching it that he really asked himself whether he wanted to. Little things had been coming up with us, nothing big really. You know, we never really fought, but there had been minor little things that we sort of focused on so that we didn't have to talk about the fact that we were sort of going in different directions, she told him. She was working, I wasn't. She wanted to come back here, I didn't. John had made his feelings known to her right around the time I was ending things with Tristan, and I don't know. We were just sort of missing each other. And as a result of that, we were spending more time with friends we cared about, less away from each other. And then I met Gadri. He nodded. I know she never liked him. She laughed lightly. You could say that. She saw who he was right away. You know, I think at the time, I thought he liked me in spite of the fact that I was sort of lost. It took me a while to realize that he liked me because of that. I didn't have any direction, which meant things went his way. His stomach churned at that, the grossness of it, the predatory nature of it. She would have been maybe 21 when she met him, and Gadri had been in his early 40s. Looking for a girl to mold, and when he couldn't anymore, trying to smash her into place. He had been curious about him, wanting to learn more about his personality, so that he would know what to prepare for. He had watched some interviews with him, and even predisposed to thinking he was an asshole, which he was. He could see how he drew people in. So rather than listen to your best friend, he mused. Annoyance getting the better of him, who knew you better than anyone, who loved you better than anyone. Yes, she threw her hands up. Yes, okay. I didn't listen to Sangza. I'm sure you've never done that. He looked at her. Oh, this is about Roslyn, then. I don't recall them getting along. Myrcella shrugged. No, they didn't, he agreed. Somehow I managed not to lose my sister over it. Yeah, Myrcella nodded, and then shook her head, her eyes pooling with tears, and she looked down. Yeah. You did. I'm sorry, he said, an automatic response to making a woman cry. No, you're right. She wiped her eyes and looked back up. She pulled her sweater more fully over her hands as she looked for the words. I didn't know how to handle it. It was my fault. I know it was my fault. I pushed her away. And you know it, we had been so close, that any amount of distance, I don't mean proximity-wise, though she'd moved back here by then, any amount of distance just felt so insurmountable. And we kept getting caught in the holes, you know. We had gotten to a point where we weren't involved in our daily lives, so every update had so much context to it, and the characters were changing and we didn't know them. And it just got really hard. And I don't know, maybe this sounds like a cop-out, but I think I took our friendship for granted. Not to say that I didn't care about her, or love her, or miss her. I mean the fact of it, our friendship. I had never known my life without it, and I thought that was the same thing as being guaranteed to always have it. But of course that's not how things work, that's not how people work, and by the time I realized that, it was too late. He wasn't satisfied. Regardless of whether it was his place or not. That didn't matter. He wanted more. He wanted to find some proof of malintent. Otherwise, it was just a tragedy. No matter how much she took responsibility for it, it was impossible to hear that version of events and not feel sympathy for her, not understand her side. He didn't want to hear that she had been missing Sangza all the time, that Sangza had been missing her. He wished he could be happy about that, but he couldn't. And he knew why. When our father died, he started. Rob, she shook her head. Please don't. No you don't, he all but spat at her. Where were you? You'd drifted apart. Fine. Things were awkward. I got that. Do you have any idea how much he loved you? Yes, she answered hollowly, a tear falling down her cheek that he wouldn't dare apologize for. But I wasn't in the right place to. Well, I'm sorry our dad didn't die at a more convenient time for you, he interrupted, and she flinched as though he'd slapped her. He shook his head, not wanting to frighten her, and forced himself to calm down. Do you have any idea how much we all? You came for the funeral and then you just left right away. When our mom died you didn't leave our house for 3 weeks, Myrcella, he reminded her. It reminded him too, though. She had been 16, but she'd shown grace beyond her years. She'd gotten his dad to eat, gotten Sangza to sleep, gotten Bran fresh air, and gotten Rukun to cry. That didn't even mention the hours she'd spent at his mom's bedside when she was sick, reading to her, reminiscing, painstakingly transcribing all of the recipes his mom had never bothered to write down, knowing that in a year's time one of them would crave the white bean soup that seemed so tossed together yet always tasted exactly the same. He had come home from university, taking a short leave, prepared to leave it all behind if his siblings needed him. And they did, of course they did. They all needed each other. But in many ways, she was keeping them all from falling apart. In many ways she's the reason he felt comfortable saying goodbye and heading back to finish his semester. And if he was struggling to reconcile all the other versions of her, that one made it impossible. What happened? He asked. She shook her head and he shook his. No, no, there's no way that you would have let that stop you from being there. I know you wouldn't. So what happened? This was a little over 3 years ago. He hadn't stopped to think about it then, with everything going on with him and Roslyn, but now he wished that he had. He wished he had seen it as alarming rather than aggravating. There's no excuse, she told him. She looked him dead in the eye. I have no excuse. Though he'd been so eager for proof of malintent before, he now remembered she wasn't capable of it. It wasn't in her nature. She wasn't perfect, but her heart was. It always had been. But there is an explanation, he said more gently, isn't there? She nodded, more tears slipping out of her eyes. But I'm not, now is not the appropriate time to talk about it. Just know that I've never been. She stopped speaking as her lip wobbled, her eyes filling with more and more tears. He wanted to tell her it was okay, but she seemed to want to say this. She let out a shaky breath, taking control of herself. I have made a lot of bad choices, but I have never been sorrier about anything as I am for that. He nodded, I'm sorry I brought it up. She wiped her cheek with her sweater and reminded him, I asked you to. Then she looked at him and asked, is there anything else you're mad at me about? He shook his head, no, that's all. Not even for when I slammed your finger in the car door, she wondered, the hints of a smile on her lips. He chuckled, and admitted to them both, not even for that. It was overwhelming. Not being angry with her. Standing there with her after all this time. And he realized what he should have done the moment he saw her. The moment he saw her bruised eye and her frightened daughter. The moment he knew that she'd come back to them. He walked around the island and pulled her gently off the chair, and into his arms. Her body felt so small against his, too thin, too little, too vulnerable. She was hesitant for a moment, and then her arms wrapped around his back, her hands pressing to his shoulder blades as though she was afraid he'd change his mind. His hand stroked into her hair and thought about what his dad would say if she'd walked through his door. You're home, he told her, and it's all going to be okay. The sob she let out went from her chest straight into his own, and he held her tighter, letting it die in between them. Her hands gripped his shirt, as her shoulders shook. He tried to take slow, measured breaths, his hand moving in a deliberate pattern over her back. Sooner than he would have thought, she quieted. How will Sangza ever forgive me, she asked against him. Very easily, he told her honestly. There was no part of Sangza that wanted to be angry or upset with Myrcella. She loved her so much, all she wanted was her friend back. A whisper of an apology was all it would take. Even still, he teased, but starting with you were right should soften her right up. She laughed against him, the full, joyous laugh that only came after a good cry. Pulling out of his arms, she wiped her face, her eyes red and her forehead and cheeks blotched from the exertion of her tears. Can I go splash some water on my face, she asked. Oh yeah, it's just through there, he gestured towards the hallway powder room. She walked away and Grey Wind's head popped up and looked at him accusingly and then followed after her. He heard her exclaim when Grey Wind followed her into the bathroom, and sipped his coffee, grimacing at its overt sweetness. He looked down at the papers he had for her to sign. They looked cold and clinical in this room that was still filled with her pain. She came back a moment later, Grey Wind trotting at her side. I'm really sorry, she said to him. You don't have to apologize to me, he told her, though you and Sai. No, I'm sorry that I'm stealing your dog, she told him. She stroked Grey Wind's head, who looked up at her, all but smiling. She turned back to look at him, but Joey will say kind words to him about you from time to time. He chuckled, she would too, you know, proximity to Grey Wind is just one of the perks of taking the guest house. She smiled and then replaced it with a wary, hesitant look. Are you sure that's something you really want to offer? Yeah, he answered, come on. Let me show it to you. If the other places you looked at are a better fit, then fine, and we'll just have Grey Wind and Ghost switch off on nightly patrols. She smiled and nodded, so he gestured towards the doors at the other end of the kitchen, that lead into the backyard. They walked outside, Grey Wind running ahead to pounce on a leaf. It was grey out, the sort of grey that made the changing colors of the trees all the more vivid. He glanced over at her and found her smiling as she took in the expansive backyard, color whipped into her cheeks at the first note of fresh air. The guest house was about 400 yards from the main house. Back when this had been more of an estate, it had been the caretaker's cottage, and then refurbished and expanded by previous owners to turn it into a proper guest house. Oh, she smiled, her eyes lingering on the front porch. He didn't want to push too hard, so he led her silently up the stone walkway and then onto the navy blue floor of the porch. He had come out earlier to unlock everything and open up a window or two to get some air circulating, so he opened the front door, pushing it wide and gesturing for her to go in. She wiped her boots on the mat and then stepped inside, peering around. "There's a full security system," he said. "It's hooked up to the main house one and alerts go straight to my phone, but we could set it so it went to yours, too." She turned around, her hand on the end of the banister, and said, "You really think he's going to come after me?" He shook his head. "I really don't know. He doesn't seem like the sort of guy to just accept this. But maybe his ego won't let him chase you. I really couldn't say. And I really don't like that." Her eyes wandered over him as though she might ask him something else, but she merely nodded after a moment. He brought her into the kitchen and living room. It wasn't big, but it was well appointed and the appliances were all new, the furniture comfortable and clean. "Rukun lived here the year after he graduated university," he told her, "but it's been deep cleaned since." She laughed. "It's really lovely, Rob." Then she looked around, at the kitchen table, her brow furrowing. "Is that?" "Yeah," he nodded, relieved for some reason that she remembered. Like it was proof that everything she told him, everything she showed him was true. That she loved his family as much as he thought she did. "When we sold Winterfell, we all took some of the furniture. I'd like to have this in the house, but there's no right place for it." "It looks good here," she told him gently. "The TV has cable and everything, but it's a smart TV, so you can sign into your apps or whatever," he said, and she gave him an amused look, but for some reason he couldn't stop, so he said, "And this is on the main house generator, so you'll be fine if there's a storm or anything." She nodded solemnly. "Yes, good, I was going to ask." He chuckled. "I don't know what to say, I'm a lawyer, not a realtor." She grinned. "You saw me cry, so I have to make fun of you a little." He nodded. "Seems fair." Then he gestured above him. "There are 2 bedrooms upstairs, and a little office that has a pull-out couch if you'd ever need it. Do you want to go up?" She looked around the downstairs and nodded. He showed her the powder room on the way back to the stairs, and then opened the coat closet until she nudged him in the back to walk up, laughing at him. They went up and he showed her the office first, and then the larger bedroom. It looked out onto the rest of the property and into the woods. The previous owner had apparently fixed it up for his daughter, so the bathroom was far more modern than the house would suggest. Last he took her into the twin room, where he'd let JJ and Kitty camp out one night over the summer. She stopped in the doorway, her hand to her chest, looking at the 2 beds against either wall. "These are also from Winterfell," he told her. "I know," she said, almost in a whisper. He stood in the doorway as she walked into the room, going to the bed on the left and reaching behind, her fingers seeming to trace against the wood. She closed her eyes and smiled, before walking over to the next one. She repeated the same gesture, and then let out a teary laugh. Before he could ask, she motioned to him to come over. What he started to ask. She took his wrist in her hand and then moved up it, over his palm, taking hold of his middle and index fingers, and pulled them to the back of the bed. Under her guidance he pressed his fingers to the wood, feeling the smoothness until it was interrupted by a small but deep recess. Her hand moved his fingers up and then diagonally down and then diagonally up, until the letter M appeared underneath them. He felt a small twinge in his chest as he followed her along the place where she'd carved the letter B. Myrcella still held his fingers in her hand, and his arm was then casing her back to his chest. He could smell the sweetness of her shampoo, and see the different colors of gold in her hair, and he wanted to step away but he wasn't able to move. She looked up at him and smiled shyly, releasing his fingers and turned around so that they were facing one another. "I know it's kind of silly," she told him, "but this sort of makes me feel like a part of me was here, all this time." He nodded, clearing his throat once again. "Yeah, I know what you mean." Chapter 6. Summary. This chapter ended up being a lot longer than I expected. Also, sorry for the weird spacing. I wrote this in 2 different formats and so something wonky is going on and I've exhausted myself trying to fix it, so just bear with me. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Ashumksulp's time, JJ informed him. Will looked over at his little brother and then at him. "He's gross but he's right." He chuckled. "I can't make sloppy joes all the time, but they are going on the repeat list for sure." It had been a rare afternoon where neither of the boys had an after-school activity or a playdate, and after his conversation with Ursula he'd found it hard to focus on work, so he'd given their nanny the afternoon off and spent it with them. He'd gotten out the lacrosse sticks and they'd played catch and then taken Grey Wind for a long walk in the woods, until Grey Wind was panting and the boys' cheeks were flushed. JJ loved to be in the woods. He liked to pretend that he was one of the first men. Kitty always chose to be one of the children of the forest in their games, pretending to throw magic weapons at him, but he and Will pretended to be from rival clans, picking up sticks and dueling with them. When they'd gotten home, they'd all sat at the kitchen table and done their homework. He would have gladly taken JJ's multiplication set over his emails, but his son wouldn't trade. After a while he faded into the background, the muscle memory of their afternoons together taking over for the boys. He got to see the differences between them, from everything to their work to their sitting styles. Will liked to sit with both feet on the ground, his head bent over his history worksheet that he was highlighting. JJ sat on the chair up on his knees, stretched at what would seem like an uncomfortable degree, his elbows on the table as he wrestled with his math problems. He got to see the way JJ wordlessly slid his paper over to Will, who started proofing it for him. "You have to show your work," Will reminded him. "But I got the answers right," JJ had protested. "Didn't I?" "Yeah, but they don't care," Will told him. "That's dumb," JJ noted. "That's the rule," Will resolved. A microcosm of who they were. JJ always questioning, his mind creative and nimble, a fascination with history not translating to a respect for tradition. Will always drawing inside the lines, navigating the world with determination but not wonder. Both of them were right, both of them were wrong. He'd gotten dinner together and made the boys pack up their school bags, choosing their snacks for lunch the next day and trying to restore order to JJ's language arts folder. He grabbed JJ's fork and picked a bit of the sloppy joe filling out of the bowl and tried it. Maybe they should have it all the time, it was oddly satisfying. Though he'd become adequate in the kitchen, he wasn't talented by any stretch, but when he'd heard someone talking about them he'd thought this would be a winner. The boys really liked DIY dinners, like tacos and pizzas, where they could sort of make their own from a selection of ingredients. Those were the easiest because if someone didn't like something they didn't have to have it and it didn't throw off the entire meal. His mom had used to do those sorts of things when he was growing up. He'd always imagined it was because it was fun, until he became a parent to two children with differing taste buds and realized that as a mother of 5 it was probably more about survival. "Why aren't you eating?" JJ asked. "I've got a dinner thing," he answered, which was truthful enough, but he still felt odd when Will looked over at him. "That's why Uncle John is coming to hang out. Guys' night," JJ declared with a grin and then determined, "He has too many girls in his house now." Will told him, "He likes it." JJ scoffed, "How do you know?" "Because I asked," Will noted, taking another bite of his sloppy joe. "Besides, Ursula and Joey are cool." JJ's nose wrinkled, "Joey doesn't play or even talk." "She does if you shut up and listen," Will disagreed with him. "Will," he warned. They weren't really supposed to use that phrase, though that was a losing battle with Will now in middle school, some of the kids on his team with older brothers in high school. Soon, he knew, shut up was going to be the least of his problems. "Well, him and Kitty are always screaming around her," Will argued, "she doesn't like that." "Because she's a baby," JJ cut in. "JJ," he warned. "She's only 6," JJ reasoned, as though 2 years was an unimaginable amount of time. He took another bite of his sloppy joe and mused, "Ursula's so pretty though. She looks like Sleeping Beauty or Rapunzel, some kind of princess. She even has a weird name like one." He and Will chuckled at that assessment, which was true on both counts. It was impossible for any parent to know what to do all the time, but he felt even less equipped, since he was raising the boys on his own. It wasn't really like he could pick up the phone and call Roslyn. She would pretend to listen for 2 minutes and then interrupt him and say, "Wait, are the boys okay?" And once he confirmed that no one was bleeding from a major artery, she'd say that she had to go. That had been the way of it for as long as he could remember. She had seemed to want kids in the beginning, but he soon realized that she wanted them in the same way that she wanted to visit 100 cities by the time she was 25 and know how to make a decent loaf of bread. It was just something that she was checking off her list, some arbitrary set of goals instilled in her, without any understanding that 2 living, breathing children required much more than a stamp in her passport. He ran things by John or Sangza all the time, but sometimes he couldn't help but envy their partnership. Like now, he wasn't sure what to do. He understood why JJ wasn't taken with Joey. She was quiet and kept to herself, and was not a great playmate for a rambunctious 8-year-old boy. Particularly when the girl that he knew best in the world was Kitty, who if anything was more spirited than he was. He couldn't explain to him in any way he'd understand why Joey was the way that she was, and though Ursula was probably right and Joey did need to make steps towards becoming more social, he didn't necessarily want to teach JJ that there was something wrong with her either. Kids were different, and he didn't believe that being introverted was something to overcome, and he didn't want JJ to feel that way either. A part of him wanted to simply say that he had to be nice because she was practically a part of the family, but he wasn't sure that was a real lesson either. Besides, JJ was nice to Joey. He'd seen it. And was there any kind of lesson in telling JJ he was wrong for how he was feeling? Was it wrong, not to want to play with someone who didn't share your interests? These were the questions he asked himself on an easy day. For better or worse, unless there was some sort of shift in his behavior, he was going to file this under the let kids be kids. There was merit in letting them sort things out for themselves. The way to be a good person wasn't to stay within an arbitrary set of lines for fear of punishment or reprimand. Besides, it didn't seem like Will was going to suffer any bullshit in this area anyway. For whatever reason, he had taken to Joey immediately. He was older, wasn't necessarily expecting her to be his friend, which might have helped. Their dispositions, too, though different, were more well suited to one another. They were both quiet and introspective, their eyes seeing so much more than their mouths would ever say. It seemed to go beyond that, though. Will had seen right through Ursula's excuse for her black eye, so maybe he saw through some of Joey's quiet courtesy too. Whatever the cause, he had decided that Joey was someone for him to protect. Who is the villain? Will asked him. He wondered, picking a grape out of the fruit bowl. In Ursula's fairy tale, Will explained, his tully eyes appraising him. Before he could figure out how to answer him, Grey Wind stood up barking and JJ ran to the door shouting Uncle John. Will and he sat at the table, looking at one another. It was one of those times he knew that he had failed as a parent. He had just acknowledged that Will had seen through Ursula's explanation of her black eye, yet had failed to grasp what that meant. Will knew that someone had hurt Ursula. Of course, he did. A part of him had known that he knew, yet he'd said nothing about it. He had taken Will's lack of questions about it as a confirmation that he didn't have any. But of course, in spite of his maturity, Will was only 11 years old. Maybe he hadn't had the right words. Maybe he'd needed his little brother to put it into terms that were more legible, a fairy tale where there was good and bad, in order to be able to ask. It didn't make it any easier though to explain that sometimes the prince was really a villain in disguise. He was about to try though when Will shook his head. Will, a giggling voice greeted him. Hey kitten, Will responded. He turned around to find John standing there with Kitty thrown over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, Joey standing at his side, her hand in his free one. Both the girls were in their pajamas and sneakers, Joey's 2 big backpacks slung over John's other shoulder. Hey girls, he greeted them, standing up. Felt like joining guys' night. Yeah. Kitty agreed, reaching out for him. He pulled her off John and she wrapped her arms and legs around him, looking more like a koala bear than a kitten. She pressed a kiss to his cheek and then pulled away to look at him better. Are you you can't stay, she asked, widening her eyes. Don't you dare, he grinned at her. She giggled and then scratched his cheek. You need to shave. He scratched the top of her hair. You need to shave. Kitty let out her infectious giggle and he asked her, are you guys hungry? No, Auntie Ursula made. Joey, what is it called? Kitty asked. Eggplant parmesan, Joey supplied in her soft, lilting voice. It was so good, Kitty informed him. So good. John agreed, making Joey giggle. John looked down at her and grinned. Don't you dare, sweetheart. Go on, tell them what you called me. No, Joey giggled, hiding her face against John's arm. So clearly some progress had been made there. She called him a goblin, Kitty told him. Then explained, because he was gobbling up everybody's leftovers. He chuckled, good old Uncle Goblin. I can see it, can't you, JJ? JJ suggested, Uncle Johnlin. Will chuckled in surprise at the table and repeated, Uncle Johnlin. This set the girls off and John pointed at them all, traitors, the lot of you. I don't deserve this sort of treatment, I are those sloppy joes. The kids all found this hilarious, but Will was taking his plate to the sink and asking if he could go read, and JJ was reveling that he had unexpected playdate in Kitty, and John was sitting down and making himself a sloppy joe on JJ's discarded plate. Joey had disappeared as well, but then he looked under the table and saw her sitting there petting Grey Wind. So he said to John. John took a bite and then pointed at it and nodded, before telling him, Sansa and Myrcella wanted to have dinner, just the two of them, to talk. Oh, he nodded and then realized what he'd just said. Oh, that's great. He had felt better after his conversation with Myrcella. He hadn't realized how long he'd been angry at her, and how much it was wearing on him to be angry at her. Sitting in the same room as her, when talking and teasing and laughing with her felt like the most natural thing in the world. There was guilt there now too, he could see it more easily now that his anger with her had dissipated, but of the two he was more comfortable with that. The real conversation though that needed to happen was between her and Sansa. He couldn't imagine the layers of hurt the two of them had to go through, the miscommunications and the rifts, the edges of the break that had pierced and then scarred them both. But he knew without question, that they were pieces that could always be fit back together. They just had to try, and now they were. John nodded, but didn't say more given that Joey was underneath the table. He left him to go get ready. His date tonight with Cecily was one of the other reasons he'd wanted to spend the afternoon with the boys. He'd sort of forgotten the date was going to be happening, in the mess of everything else, and it hadn't been until Myrcella had left that he'd bothered to look at his phone and saw that Cecily had texted him. Feeling a bit gross after playing with the boys all afternoon, he hopped in the shower. He didn't know if Cecily would mind his scruff as much as Kitty did, but he shaved it anyway. Standing in front of his closet, he didn't know what to wear. For their last date, he'd come right from work so he hadn't had to think about it. Now, he didn't know what the thing to do was. It felt strange to put on a suit and tie now, at the end of the day. But he also didn't want to look like a slob. Warily, he grabbed a pair of jeans and a white button-up and pulled those on. He looked like he was in an Abercrombie & Fitch ad from when he was growing up, and not in a good way. If there was a good way for that. He put on a pair of brown leather shoes and grabbed a mossy green sweater and a navy blue sweater and then headed back downstairs. Walking through the living room, he found Will sitting on the couch reading. He could hear JJ and Kitty laughing in the playroom. He walked back into the kitchen and found John sitting at the table with Joey. Which should I wear? He asked him, holding up both sweaters. John looked at him. Is that a serious question, or do you think I miss your sister so much that you're impersonating her? I love how you say your sister as though she isn't your wife, he mused. When she is making me choose between two identical tops, she is your sister, John explained. He chuckled, fair enough so. Before John could give him any more shit, Joey told him, you should wear the blue. It goes better with your eyes. His was still looking at John, so he saw him roll his eyes in annoyance, and he couldn't help but grin and say to Joey, thank you, honey. At least one of you is helpful. She smiled and he set the green sweater down on the back of one of the kitchen chairs and then pulled on the navy blue sweater. He held his arms out, yes. She looked at him and nodded and then tilted her head to the side and waved him towards her. He walked over to her and she looked up at him hesitantly, glancing briefly at John. Whatever she saw there gave her the assurance to take one of his arms in her little hands and pull the cuff of his shirt so that it showed at the edge of his sweater sleeve. She then repeated the gesture to the other sleeve. Her pale green eyes scrutinized him for a moment and then she smiled, perfect. Thank you, he said, stroking her hair gently, then wondered, do you need anything? You could go play with JJ and Kitty, or Will is reading in the other room. That's okay, thank you, Rob, she offered quietly, turning back to the table. I'm going to work on this if that's okay. Of course. He stepped away and went to the counter to grab his wallet and keys, and then, though Myrcella said she didn't have any, he asked, is that homework? She shook her head, looking thoughtfully at the pile of colored pencils in front of her before selecting a pale blue. "No, it's the story I'm writing for Mommy. Auntie Sangza said she'd sew it together like a real book when I'm done with it. She's so good at sewing, and she said I could pick out whatever colors I wanted. And she said she'd teach me to sew and knit. But I have to be a little bigger for that." That was without a doubt the most words he'd heard her say, maybe ever, but definitely all at once. He and John glanced at one another, realizing simultaneously that they were competing for a distant second place. Sangza clearly was going to be top billing. "Am I in it?" John asked. "No," Joey melodically giggled, "it's a make-believe story. And it has a happy ending. Those are Mommy's favorite." He sort of wished that Will had been in the room, so that he could see that even if Ursula was the princess in her own story, she was the hero in Joey's. "I'm sure she's going to love it," he told her genuinely. "Will you do me a favor and make sure Goblin here behaves himself?" She nodded, a small smile on her face, and then grabbed a fresh piece of paper and a few colored pencils and nudged them towards John. With another nod to John, he called his goodbyes to the boys and Kitty, and headed out to his car. The air was starting to get cooler at night. His Instagram had been full of pictures of couples and families apple picking. Sometimes Sangza made him and the boys go with them, but none of them really liked it. They would take a lot of pride in picking the best pumpkin in a few weeks, but they preferred the apples he got at the grocery store. He thought about Kitty though, and the way she'd get on his or John's shoulders to get a particularly appealing one. He couldn't help but wonder if Joey had ever done such a thing. Gadri probably wouldn't have deemed it an advance enough activity for her. On the way to the restaurant, he practiced what he planned to say to the judge when he asked for sole custody for the duration of the proceedings. It had become something of a mental tic for him, something he did in the shower, or on his way to work. Any moment he had alone really. He'd practice the words he'd say to keep her from him. Sometimes he went off into righteous indignation, sometimes he kept to just the facts. Every time though in his head he won. The fact that there was no other option made it a bit simpler. He had been so relieved, when Ursula agreed to stay in his guest house. They'd haggled for the better part of an hour, all while he made them lunch and then through eating it. Other topics had been covered, too, surprisingly many, but she kept going back to "I think you should charge me $2,000 a month." Apparently that was the going rate. His counter was $0. Her next offer was $2,500. She was happy to go up to $2,800 if he would make her the grilled cheese he'd made for lunch once every 2 weeks. He told her he'd throw those in for free if she shut up about paying him money. It wasn't an entirely productive conversation, but somehow they'd ended up at a compromise that neither of them were very happy about. She wouldn't pay rent, but she would pay for any utilities they used. She'd asked if she could split the cost of landscaping, and he'd told her to talk to Sangza instead and he'd consider that more than her share. And now she was. He wondered how that conversation was going, whether they were crying. If he had to guess, they'd been on their own for nearly an hour, so they were probably having a dance party by now. He had meant what he said to Ursula, Sangza would forgive her so easily. In many ways, she already had. And though a part of him still wished that Sangza would demand a massive apology, he knew that having her best friend back, truly back, would heal her more than any apology ever could. Downtown was busy, or maybe this was normal for this part of town on a Wednesday night. He parked a ways away from the restaurant and walked towards it, the crowd a mix of people leaving work and those heading out for the night. The restaurant was already busy, and he gave his name to the girl, likely a university student, at the hostess stand. If he wasn't mistaken, she was making eyes at him, which was flattering but concerning. She was little more than a child, closer in age to Will than to him. Probably the same age difference between the two of them as Gadri and Ursula, the girl nearly as young as Ursula had been when they would have met. He looked at the girl as he sat down. She was pretty, everything about her was perky, there was an appeal to that, which he understood on a biological level. Not enough to ever act on it though. Well enough to recognize it for the blood sport it really was. He thanked her and then pulled out his phone so that she wouldn't linger, sending Cecily a text to let her know he was at the table. She breezed in a few minutes later, pressing a kiss to her cheek. She smelled like something spicy and warm, cinnamon maybe. It was nice, even if it made him wrinkle his nose a bit. The hostess is such a bitch, she greeted him. He startled at that, pouring her some water from the bottle someone had brought to the table. Really? She seemed fine to me. Oh well, you would think so, she noted. He glanced at her and she grinned, kidding. Hi. Hi, he said, taking her in. You look lovely. Slightly better than telling her that her face looked good like he'd done to Ursula earlier that day. Lovely wasn't exactly an appropriate description. Her black-lined eyes and plunging neckline brought other adjectives to mind, but it was the best he could think of. She laughed. You look hot. I am a bit. Didn't think through this sweater, he noted. Oh my god, such a dad joke. She nudged his leg under the table. He shrugged, as though he'd been joking, not bothering to remind her that he was a dad. She knew that. Their server came and they ordered wine, and once they'd brought it she narrowed her eyes at him. Rob, I have to ask you something, she told him. Okay, he said. She took a sip of wine, tossing her hair slightly off one shoulder, and said, my girlfriends are telling me you're not into me, because you don't text. But I think it's a generational thing. Your thoughts? I'm saying that you have no idea what it takes for two women to maintain a friendship. How intertwined your lives are. Ursula had said that earlier. How involved in every aspect of each other's lives girls were. How weird it was not to be in constant communication. He nodded. I don't know if it's a generational thing, but it is a me thing. Not much of a texter. She wrinkled her nose. That doesn't seem to be the answer you were looking for. She shrugged and then smiled. Well, obviously I want you to tell me you're obsessed with me and aren't texting so that you don't scare me off. He chuckled. Well, maybe I'm not telling you I'm obsessed with you so as not to scare you off. Her dark eyes appraised him and she shook her head. No, you're not. And I don't actually expect or want you to be. I just don't want to waste my time, either. A second date felt a little soon for the where is this going conversation. He didn't even know where he wanted it to go yet, if anywhere. This was making him feel a little like he was in court though. He didn't really want to get into it, but he could at least promise one thing. I won't waste your time, he told her. She seemed to understand that this was the most she was going to get and nodded and then smiled ruefully. Good, because this, she gestured to her general appearance, doesn't just happen, you know. Dinner went on like that. There was a push and pull to it that was at times amusing and at other times exhausting. She was clearly very bright, and too old to be described as precocious, though that was the word that came to mind. When their server asked if they wanted dessert, she looked at him and said, you did promise me ice cream, so he just got the check and walked her around the corner to a gelato place Sangza liked. The scoops were comically large and dripping down their fingers, the napkins ill-prepared to deal with the stickiness, and most of everything went in the bin. As they stood outside, her body wiggled in an imitation of a shiver, stepping closer to him. There was no push now, only pull, and her lips tasted like pistachio gelato and red wine when they met his. It felt good to kiss someone, his body wanting it more than he did. Want to come over, she whispered into his mouth. A part of him did. I should get back, the kids, he said instead. She smiled, imagining he was pulling, so she pushed. You know, I always liked it when the parents stayed out late when I was babysitting. Extra money. He laughed. Well, my brother-in-law is with them, and I don't pay him. She grinned. He fucks your sister, I'd say he owes you one. He grimace laughed. On that note, I really should get back. I can drop you off on my way though. She looked at him, seeming to decide whether he was just playing a game or not. He tried not to show any sign of weakness, even though it had been far too long since he'd slept with someone. Even though he imagined she was good at it. When she realized he meant it, she stepped away slightly, a light dimming in her eyes ever so slightly, and nodded. No, my friends are out, I'll go meet them for a drink. Okay, he nodded, I can walk. I don't need you to walk me, she said with a smile, though there was a sharpness in her voice too. As though a part of her thought he was only offering to make himself sound better when she told her friends about him. He wasn't, but since he imagined he'd come across looking like a dick no matter what, he couldn't help but at least try to show that he wasn't one. Okay, he nodded again. Well, a good night then. I'll text you. She smiled and shook her head. Doesn't really sound like you, bye Rob. He headed back to the car, wondering if he should have done something differently. Wondering why he didn't care more that he hadn't. She was pretty and smart, his dad would have called her spunky. Maybe it was just because he couldn't imagine introducing her to JJ and Will. Maybe no one could matter to him anymore if they didn't matter to them. He pulled down his driveway and parked in his usual spot. He'd start parking in front of the house, let Marcella have the spot closer to the walkway that would lead to the guest house. When he got into the house, he was surprised that John met him in the foyer. He was about to ask if everything was okay, when John raised a finger to his lips and beckoned for him to follow him. They walked through the hallway and into the living room. It was past 9 o'clock, but Will was sitting on the couch. There was little point in asking him why he was still awake. Joey was draped across him, her head resting on one of his legs, fast asleep. Someone had put a blanket over her tiny form, and Grey Wind had hopped up on her other side, his head resting on her hip. Will looked over at them and hissed, "I have to pee." He and John chuckled quietly, and he nudged John's chest, "Go get Kitty, I've got her." John went upstairs to the guest room where Kitty stayed when she slept over. The bed was big enough that both of the girls could have gone to sleep in there, but clearly Joey had fallen asleep in the midst of something and neither John or Will had wanted to move her. He wasn't any more eager to do so, except to relieve Will, who he knew would sit in a silent, very uncomfortable vigil all night if left without intervention. Keeping the blanket wrapped around her, he picked Joey up. She was so much lighter than JJ or even Kitty, those 2 years seeming as insurmountable as his son had made them seem. It made him ache a little, remembering the other kids at her age, wishing he'd known her when she was even younger, held her as a baby. She woke up and he told her, "It's me, Rob." Joey didn't even say hello, she just fell right back to sleep with her head on his shoulder. He looked around to see if she'd left anything as Will sprinted to the bathroom, but all that was there was a disgruntled Grey Wind and Will's book of mythology. His one concession to the imaginary. He must have been reading to her. He went into the kitchen and saw that she had already neatly packed up her backpack. He slung it over his shoulder and brought her outside to John's car. Once he'd gotten her buckled into her booster seat, he tucked the blanket around her and settled the backpack at her feet. John came out with Kitty awake but in his arms, her auburn hair falling out of its braid. "Get a little bit of that." John pointed to the crook of her neck. She giggled when he pressed a kiss to it, warmed from sleep. "Oh no, the baby's too delicious. She has to stay here." "All right," John agreed, plopping Kitty in his arms. "Darling," Kitty tried to chastise but was laughing too hard. "You'd miss me too much." "Oh right, I forgot, I need to bring the baby with me." John took her back from him. "Thanks again," he said to him. Then asked, following John around to the other side of the car so he could get Kitty settled, "How do you think it went?" John buckled her and then shut the door, an incredulous smile on his face. "Apparently I'm sleeping alone tonight." His brow furrowed and John explained, "They are having a sleepover in Marcella's room." "Thank God." He ran his hand through his hair. "You knew they'd work it out," John said, then nodded at him. "Seems like you had something to do with it." "What did you do?" He shrugged. "I told them to work it out." John smirked. "Groundbreaking." They said goodnight and he headed back inside as John drove off. To his surprise, Will was waiting for him in the hall. "Thank you for being so good to Joey," he said to him. Will shrugged. "It's no big deal." "It is a big deal," he told him. "She clearly feels really comfortable around you and I know that it may not be fun to hang out with a 6-year-old but I don't mind," Dad Will told him. His brow furrowed and he shook his head. "I don't know, it's weird." "What's weird?" he asked. "It's sort of like I think just kind of," Will trailed off, seemingly at a loss. "Want to look out for her," he suggested. "I guess so." Will shrugged again. "Isn't that what you and Uncle John are doing? Shouldn't I do it too?" "Yeah, but we knew her mom when she was Joey's age," he told him. "Was Marcella like Joey?" Will asked. "Yes and no." He thought about it. "Joey has her sweetness, but Marcella was more outgoing." Will nodded and then said, "You never answered my question." He sighed. "Yeah. Look, Will. It was Joey's dad, wasn't it?" Will asked. He nodded, "Yes." Will's jaw clenched, and his heart broke when he heard the way that his son forced his voice deeper, as though he had to be more grown up to ask, "Did he ever hurt Joey?" "No," he promised, "not like that." Will shook his head, "But Merciless so nice. She's, so. He wasn't hurting her because she deserved it, he tried to explain. He was just bad. Will seethed. Sometimes he tried to make Will see the world in shades of grey, not everything was black and white. This was though. Yeah, he agreed. But it's never going to happen again. He realized then that he hadn't told the boys, and look, I was going to tell you guys tomorrow, but Mercilla and Joey are going to stay in the guest house for a little while. Where we can look out for them. Will nodded. Good idea. Look, Will, Mercilla is an adult. I'm still bigger than her, Will noted. He chuckled, well that's true, but even still, you're a kid, and it's all well and good for you to look out for Joey, but, you just let me handle anything that comes up, okay? Will eyed him warily, as careful with his promises as he and John were, and asked instead, how could anyone hurt her? He shook his head and told him honestly, I don't know. Will nodded, not pressing the issue, and instead asked, where did you go tonight? I had a date, he told him honestly. I've started to date a bit, do you want to talk about that? Will looked thoughtfully for a moment and asked, was she pretty? That was not the question he thought he'd get, but he told him, yeah, she's pretty. Will then wondered, is she nice? Kind of, he answered, and then told him the part that mattered, I won't be seeing her again. But I will probably date other people. Like Mercilla? Will asked. What? He grimaced, no. Why would you think that? Will shrugged and explained with all reasonable logic, she's pretty and nice. So are a lot of people, he told him. Yeah, but not that pretty, Will grinned. He chuckled, all right, go to bed. Will went up the stairs laughing, and he went to go let Grey Wind out. As he got into bed, he grabbed his phone. He intended to send a text to Cecily, to thank her for the date, but maybe sort of make it clear there shouldn't be another one. Though she seemed to already know that. He got distracted though by a message from Mercilla. Hey. Sorry we sprung the girls on you. I just wanted to thank you for our talk earlier today. Talking to you about it made it a lot easier to talk to Sangza, and you were right, telling her she was right went a long way. He chuckled and texted back, I'm well practiced in telling her that, she always is right, so annoying. I'm glad you guys talked, heard you're having a slumber party. We did face masks and watched an Audrey Hepburn movie, and Sangza passed out before 9. Did I hear you had a date? Ah, you did hear, but I should have stayed in and done face masks and watched an Audrey Hepburn movie with John. I'd pay money to see you two do that. Say something in the region of $2,000 a month. Notes. I hope you all enjoyed this. A couple of things. 1. I know some of you really wanted to see the Sangza and Mercilla conversation, but given the POV format, it didn't really make sense to me to show it because I don't think there is any way that Rob would have seen it. Mercilla would have taken full responsibility though, and they would have started to rebuild. Something I've noticed with longtime friends is that once you sort of snap out of a fight, you do fall back into things very easily, so if you see that in future chapters, it is in no way me trying to brush things under the rug, and more that I'm trying to keep it as true as I think it would be. I don't see any possibility of Sangza holding it over Mercilla's head or them being awkward with each other on a daily basis anymore once they've had that talk. There could certainly be moments, key bits of info that one of them is missing that sort of shows how deep those holes went, but in general I think with them, to forgive is in many ways to forget, and they wouldn't want to lose any more time with each other. 2. This is in no way to disregard the lovely comments that have been left by people, but I will say it is very hard to keep up momentum receiving a deteriorating amount of comments each chapter. It's impossible not to see that as a decrease in engagement. If you are enjoying this story, I'd love to hear that. It doesn't need to be lengthy or anything, it just would be helpful to know that people are still here and happy to be reading. Chapter 7. Chapter text. There was a comforting familiarity in a certain brand of chaos. Like a sound machine, it drowned everything else, recalibrating his mind to a certain degree. He often wondered if his siblings felt the same, if they ever thought about it. Their relationship to it though had always been different. Arya and Rickon often brought the chaos, Bran ignored it, and Sangza soothed it. Usually, anyway. Today she was orchestrating it. One would have thought that moving Mercilla and Joey into his guest house would be a pretty simple affair. It was fully furnished, and even if it hadn't been, it wasn't as though Myrcella had a whole lot of things to bring anyway. That didn't stop Sangza from treating it as an official moving day. Which meant that everyone had roles. It meant that there was massive reorganization going on. It meant that there were donuts. "What is this?" Sangza asked. He looked over from where he was triple-checking that the bookcase that was 200 years old was not going to spontaneously jump on Joey, to see what she was holding. He was so confused by the question that it made him feel like he was going to get the very obvious answer wrong. A plate. John had just come from upstairs where he'd been told to check all the plumbing and confirmed it for him. "Surely you've seen one before." Myrcella giggled from inside the fridge where she was arranging some of the groceries she'd brought. That beckoned a smile from Sangza, but she still chastised him. "It's hideous." "Did you get it from a dumpster?" "I think it was a wedding present," he suggested. "Good, then I can give it away," Sangza mused, putting it in an ever-growing pile of things that did not meet her standard. Myrcella closed the fridge and walked towards the kitchen table, shaking her head. She had tried to intervene once or twice, but he'd told her not to bother. Sangza was going to do what she was going to do, and he didn't care either way. Pretty soon though, this fully furnished space was going to look more like the end of a clearance sale. The door opened and Joey came in, trailed by Grey Wind, her cheeks flushed pink from the cool autumn day. "Do you need something to drink, sweetheart?" Sangza clocked her immediately. "No thank you, Auntie Sangza." "Will gave us apple cider," Joey told her. As she was passing John, she very unsneakily sneaked and poked him in the leg. John feigned total shock and poked her on one side and then other, making her giggle. His stomach clenched at the sound of it. She had the most innocent laugh he'd heard in his whole life, and the fact that he was hearing it more now did nothing to temper its effect. He couldn't get over how comfortable she'd grown with John. Every time he saw her the progress was a little unbelievable. She went over to Myrcella, beckoning her to bend down so she could whisper in her ear. He was a little worried that something had happened with the other kids, but Myrcella smiled, glancing at him briefly. "I think that's a great idea, baby. Your backpack is upstairs." "Do you remember which room is yours?" she asked. "Yes, Mommy," Joey answered dutifully. And then, like she'd heard it in a movie somewhere, she said to Grey Wind, "Come on, boy." Grey Wind knew his part, and followed along, though likely he would have regardless. Myrcella had joked she was going to steal him, but it didn't look like his dog was going to be putting up much of a fight. "I'm going to go next door and arbitrate pizza orders," he told them. "Don't give in to Kitty's request of pineapple, please." "She doesn't actually like it," Sangza said. John smirked. "I really thought we'd get to 13 or 14 before she started doing things specifically to piss us off." "She's precocious," Sangza mused, and he chuckled. "Rob," Myrcella said, and he glanced over at her. Some hair had escaped her bun and she tucked it behind her ears. "Would you stay just here just a few minutes longer?" Ever since they'd spoken on Wednesday when they'd clear the air between them, he had been sorting through the changes in his emotions. It seemed that without anger at her he was overcome by anger for her. He had filed papers earlier in the week, fixed in on his arguments to get Myrcella temporary sole custody, and he had been shaking with rage by the end of it. He would kidnap Joey himself before he let Gadri have her in his grasp. So when she asked that, his first instinct was one of protection. His skin prickled, cooling and heating at the same time. It took a moment for his mind to remember that she was with John and Sangza. That hit him at once, along with the little smile on her face, knocking the wind out of him a bit. He swallowed. "Sure." That smile of hers widened, and he returned it without having to think about it. "Rob," a hopeful little voice asked, and he turned to look at Joey who was coming down the stairs. "Yeah, honey," he asked. She started and then looked at Myrcella as she stepped down the last step. "I have something for you." "Oh," he said, "for me?" She nodded shyly. He swallowed once again and then went and sat on the couch, hoping that by making himself smaller she'd somehow be less intimidated. "Would you come show me?" She came over and stood in front of him, to the side, her little body leaning against his leg, and handed him the paper she was holding. He looked down at it and smiled. She had drawn a picture of the woods, the leaves a bunch of different colors, blue sky poking out from in between. It was surprisingly good considering she was 6, and he was pretty sure Sangza had a puzzle that looked like it. "There's a letter on the back," she told him. "Hold on, I'm still admiring your work," he told her and heard her little giggle. "This is beautiful, Joey. I love it." "Thank you. Uncle John said you had woods," she explained, "and that you love them, so I thought, well, you don't have to, but maybe it could go in your office. So you can see them during the day when you're at work." He looked up from the drawing into her hopeful, sweet face. Without thinking he stroked her cheek, and realized what he'd done soon enough to be shocked by the fact that she didn't flinch, beaming at him instead. "That's really thoughtful, and a very good idea. It's going to go right on my desk, so I can look at it all day," he promised. She tapped on it, so he turned it around dutifully. "Dear Rob. Thank you for letting me and Mommy stay in your guest house. We love it so much and promise to be really good neighbors. Mommy says we will only have parties twice a week and you are always invited. Love. Joey. P.S. Maybe Grey Wind could sleep over sometime. If he wants to." He smiled. He teared up. He chuckled. He guffawed. "What kind of parties?" he asked. "Dance parties," Joey whispered. He chuckled. "Sounds good to me. You're very welcome, Joey. But I think we should stop calling it my guest house and start calling it your house. Don't you think?" She nodded, a small smile on her face. He wanted it fuller, so he said, "And once you're settled in, we'll ask Grey Wind about a sleepover. Can he bring his lamb chop?" She giggled, "Of course he can." Then to his utter surprise, she pressed a kiss to his cheek. "I have to get back. Will is picking out books to lend to me. He is calling it the Stark Baratheon Library. I'm making library cards for us and JJ so we can trade. Do you want one?" Then glanced behind him. "Mommy, yours is green." "Oh, I'd really like one," he confirmed as Ursula thanked her. Then tilted his head. "What sort of sports magazines does this library have?" Joey's eyes went wide and then she smiled ruefully. "Whatever ones you have." He chuckled. "Perfect. Thank you." And then held up the drawing, "And thank you." She gave him another smile and then all but pranced away, Grey Wind trotting after her. The door closed behind her and John came and plopped down on the couch. He held up the drawing. "She made me a drawing. She called me Uncle John," John noted. He hadn't even registered that, but it was huge. Sangza had been auntie immediately, but John had really worked for his status. Even still, he couldn't just let him win, and he said, "She kissed my cheek." He and John turned to each other, glowering, and then grinned. He pumped his fist in the air. John intimidated a crowd going wild. They then slapped each other's hands 3 times and fist bumped like they'd done since the 2nd grade when they'd learned what secret handshakes were. It wouldn't have surprised him if the girls had laughed at them. What he hadn't expected was the sob he heard from behind them. He and John both turned around immediately, standing up as though a change in altitude might help. Sangza was the one who knew what to do though. Ursula had her face buried in her hands, her tiny shoulders slumped. Sangza went over and wrapped her arms around her and Ursula's shoulders shook. John and he looked at one another, feeling oafish and ill-prepared and like they'd somehow ruined everything. "What was I thinking?" Ursula was asking Sangza. "What was I doing? What did I do to her?" Sangza was rubbing her back, rocking Ursula the way she did with Kitty. He saw a tear fall down her cheek, but her voice was strong. "You gave her every bit of goodness you have, which is a great deal," Sangza promised. "It wasn't enough," Ursula cried. "I wasn't, oh God." He stepped around the couch, walking towards them. John fell into step with him on the other side, both of them prepared to catch her or sub in or anything useful. She seemed to sense them and turned so that her cheek was against Sangza's chest. Her eyes looked particularly green, with the whites of them an angry pink. Her cheeks were tear-stained, tendrils of golden hair matted to her forehead. It was John she looked at. "You could have been her uncle all along," she mused. Another sob escaped her. She would have been so unafraid of everything. His own heart clenched, and his hand reached out to stroke her back. "She's a quick learner," John assured her. "You'll see." She nodded, fresh tears running down her cheeks. "I'm just mortified, and sad, and sorry, Her eyes fell to his, and horribly grateful. So are we, he told her honestly. This brought on another fresh sob, and Sangza sighed, damn it, Rob, as John shook his head. That though made Myrcella laugh, and they all smiled at the sound of it. Can you stop being so selfish, John said to Sangza. Sangza looked at him, excuse me. You two have been bonding all week, even Rob, John offered his name dismissively, got a whole thing. Meanwhile I have been waiting patiently. Sangza and Myrcella laughed as Sangza released her. Myrcella wiped her cheeks and stepped towards John. She then cupped his cheeks. I think I missed you most of all, Scarecrow. Rude, Sangza coughed. Ignore her, John urged. And then fully lost his patience, and picked Myrcella up by her waist. The only thing for her to do was wrap her arms around him. It started as a joke, but then she buried her face in his neck, and he fixed his grip on her, holding her tighter. He was saying something to her too low for him or Sangza to hear, but Myrcella heard it, nodding along, and that was all that really mattered. He looked over at Sangza. They'd talked enough this week to know how well everything had gone. How much better she felt. He could see it. Still, he pulled her to him, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Come on, while they do this you can choose what else to throw out, he suggested. How attached to Theon are you, she asked. He chuckled, contractual, pretty bound. They decided, actually, to go across to his house to get together the lunch order. He also should check in with Will to make sure that he was alright being in charge. When they got outside, though, Sangza stopped walking, taking a deep breath. She walked a little further into the yard, into a break in the trees where the early afternoon sunlight could warm her face. He stood with her, knowing she would have told him if she wanted to be alone. Knowing she wouldn't tell him if she wanted him to stay. Sometimes I wonder what made her fall for him in the first place, Sangza mused. She shook her head, it never made any sense to me. She shrugged, her voice hollow. It still doesn't. I mean, do you remember what she was like? Has there ever been someone more alive? An interlude of visions. Golden and vibrant, and her. At 5, doing pirouettes in a pink tutu in his parents' foyer. At 15, making an entire party cheer when she sunk the game cup, taking a celeb shot in her pajamas. At 16, her forehead against Rukun's, bent to reach her, standing in a graveyard, promising him he'd get through this. At 21, catching the bouquet at his and Rosalind's wedding. No, he admitted. I don't understand, she shook her head. Rob, I don't understand. I don't understand. Sangza. She had you, she exploded. That startled him into silence. He had no idea what he had to do with any of it. And John, Sangza went on, even Theon. She had Dad. She knew what a good man looked like. Sangza, he shook his head, I'm not sure that's useful. And I don't think we can really expect logic to play a part in love, she asked incredulously, smiling in disbelief. She didn't love him. Never. Okay, he said, because debating that wasn't going to get them anywhere and he had no idea the truth of it. But hating yourself can look a lot like loving someone else. Sometimes. Her eyes fell to his, it can. He shrugged, not liking the way she was looking at him, like maybe he was speaking from experience. Like maybe she had crossed a line. Sometimes. He shook his head, and he would have done everything he could to confuse her. She was so young. That little girl, Sangza shook her head. I don't, every bit of magic and wonder and goodness in Joey's world came from her, and I don't want her to punish herself, but that little girl, Rob. What is she going to know? What is someone going to be able to tell her? We know better, this time, he promised. We won't be fooled. I wasn't fooled, Sangza told him stubbornly. You were, though, he countered. Not by him, no, but by her. What made you think that you were disposable? How could you think that about yourself? How could I think she didn't care enough to stay after Dad died? She fooled us. She really got us, Sangza. It won't happen again. Okay. I promise you that. Sangza's eyes flicked to his, suddenly defensive. Don't blame her for that. I don't, he assured her, I know there was something else going on. Sangza would never betray Myrcella's confidence, but her face betrayed that she had it. She knew what had happened, why Ursula had left so quickly. The curiosity and dread ate at him any time he lingered on it too long. "What was it she said?" she asked. "I'm just mortified, and sad, and sorry. And horribly grateful," he added. "Let's not forget that part." No, Sangza took a deep breath. "Let's not forget that part." Before they could say anything else, the door closed and John and Ursula joined them outside. "Guess we haven't gotten a pizza order?" John asked. "Why don't I just make sandwiches instead?" Sangza suggested. "Oh, you know what sounds really good?" Ursula mused, then coughed. "Grilled cheese." He chuckled. "Subtle." "No, that's what we're doing," John agreed, then looked at him. "Or I guess you are." "I can make some soup to go with it," Sangza said with a nod. She pulled John towards the house and Ursula stepped forward into the sunlight to stand beside him. She offered him a piece of paper, and he saw that it was the drawing Joey made for him. "Thanks, I didn't." "I know," she smiled. Teasing, when fleeing one must only take the essentials. It was a little too close to home to be truly funny, so he held up the drawing and said, "This is an essential." She smiled. She worked really hard on it. Went outside to see exactly how much the leaves had turned color. "You've got quite a fangirl." She sighed. "At least she's got good taste." He chuckled, but then he realized what she said and looked at her. "How much did you hear?" She shrugged, tilting her face up to the sun. There was something even more tender and vulnerable about it than when she had been crying. It made him feel uncomfortable. Inadequate. "Enough to know that she was right," she said. "Enough to wonder if maybe you understand more than anyone else why someone like me would have ended up with someone like him. Enough not to look for a reason, anyway," he admitted. She lowered her chin, looking up at him. "Do you think that you'll ever mistake the two again?" she asked. "No," he told her quickly and then chuckled, scratching his cheek. "I hope not anyway." "But no, I don't think so. The boys make it easier." "Yeah," she nodded. "It's easier to see someone who isn't good for them, isn't it?" He thought of his date the other night. "Yeah, it is." They stood there in a state that had long felt foreign to him. "Understanding." "So will you come?" she asked after a moment. He asked. She smiled. "To our dance parties." "We're getting boars." He smirked. "Oh good, I'll bring mine." She giggled. "You're just saying that so I won't buy you one." "There's no way you could possibly know that," he evaded, making a lasso motion. That probably wasn't what one did with a boar, but it made her laugh anyway. She pushed her hand against his arm and then seemed to think better of it halfway and wrapped her arms around his instead. He walked her towards the house and she rested her chin on his upper arm. "Are you angry I forced you into making grilled cheeses?" she asked. Livid, he smirked down at her. "Just seething." "Oh yeah? What are you going to do about it?" she teased. And it might have been funny, if it wasn't at least a little obvious that she was asking just to relish in the fact that the answer was nothing. "I'll think of something," he told her though, because if Joey had learning to do, maybe she did too. Maybe she was also in need of some recalibration. "It's gonna be like, diabolical. I might even steal your library card." She gasped, "But how will I read sports magazines?" "You really should have that of that, I guess," he chuckled as he opened the door for her. Chaos met them, and she smiled up at him. Like maybe it comforted her too. Chapter 8. Summary. Asterisk 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 please read asterisk 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 asterisk. This is a difficult chapter. I've put additional trigger warnings at the bottom of it in case anyone wants to scroll down to see. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. There was a knock on the door and his stomach lurched. He had been dreading this meeting, dreading seeing her, no matter how necessary it was. In reality, he had already seen her that morning. She had been in the driveway with Joey, heckling her daughter as she crumbled under pressure. The pressure was related to what they were going to listen to in the car on the way to school. They did it every morning, switching off who got to decide. There was a countdown. There was a pretty dramatic but convincing enactment of melting from Ursula when Joey debated too long. It was a whole thing. He and the boys would stick around and watch, shout suggestions. He had expected the choices to be between Frozen and Mona, so he'd been pretty surprised when Joey had requested Sam Cooke on Tuesday morning. To everything Joey threw out as a possibility this morning, Hercules soundtrack, Spice Girls, or something called VSQ, Mercila would say ooh good choice, but is it the right choice? Until Joey was giggling and holding on to her chiding mommy. She had caught his eye and laughed, and when the final ruling had been Hercules, JJ had asked to ride in her car. He and Will had stood there, the sounds of them all singing to I Won't Say I'm in Love wafting down the driveway, before getting into the car. He'd turned to Will and asked, what do you want to listen to, and Will had teased, anything except Hercules, and when he'd said, you good choice, but is it the right choice? Will had merely smiled. He could have said to her before she'd driven off, hey why don't we just talk at the house, but he didn't want to. He didn't want to do this in his home, or hers. Or here, for that matter, but it was better. And necessary. Come in, he called. Lewis opened the door and stepped in, his face pink and a little sweaty. He gestured behind him and opened his mouth, but no words came out. On another occasion it would have been funnier. You can send her in. Thank you, Lewis all but whispered. A moment later, Mercila appeared, holding 2 takeaway cups of coffee from the place she and Sangza had loved since middle school. Once he'd gotten his license, he'd been tasked with picking them up on his way home from practice or a friend's house. Sangza would get into the front seat and hand him the leftovers of whatever pastry she'd gotten, and he'd look in the rear view and ask Mercila, am I taking you home, and she'd say please don't, and they'd all laugh. She'd been 11. He couldn't imagine Will saying something like that. It broke his heart just to imagine it. But also to know that she had said it. That they'd known it. That they'd all laughed, even her, even him. He had wanted to have this meeting at his office so as not to drudge things like this up, to keep things separate. It was a foolish thought, to believe that would be possible with her. Thanks. He took the cup from her and sat down. She took a sip and her nose wrinkled. I think this place has gone downhill. Yeah, I think her son took it over. He took a sip of the coffee. Still tasted fine to him. Sad, she mused. Then smiled. JJ's Had's expression is hilarious. He's really got the drama down. Yeah, I know, he offered in a clipped way, and her eyes fell to his, a nanosecond of hurt passing over them at his tone. I'm sorry, do you just mind if we don't bring them into this? Of course, she nodded, her eyes closing, and she shook her head. Sorry, of course. I think I'm just a little nervous. He set his cup down and leaned towards her. I get it. Unfortunately, I've been through a lot of these, and the people in your seat always are. And I'm going to tell you what I told all of them. You're going to tell me however it comes most naturally to you. I need the facts to bring to the judge, but otherwise you can go into as much or as little detail as you want. The only thing I need you to remember is that I can't help you if you hide things from me. She had done that thing with her sleeves again, pulling them all the way down, her shoulders squirming slightly even as she nodded, her face entirely, almost disconcertingly alert. He had seen it before, and he hated seeing it in her. Instead of answering him, she set her cup down on his desk and leaned down and reached into her bag. She pulled out a cell phone, out of its case, with a sticky note on the front. 6 numbers written on it. The passcode, Joey's birthday, she said as she handed it to him. There are some texts and some voicemails. He glanced at her briefly, and then entered the passcode. Some voicemails. There were 20 at least from Gadri. Those he'd have to listen to later. He opened her texts and scrolled up and up and up. The language was obscene, the messages cruel. Mercila, he said as his eyes caught on one. I'm not showing these to you because I want to talk about them, she told him. I'm showing you so that you can use them. His eyes went to hers and then back down to the phone. She should have had a different lawyer. A different lawyer would have exulted at the sight. He had put it in writing. He would have realized it immediately, with anyone else. He put it in writing. He shook his head. He's arrogant, she shrugged, her eyes meeting his. You should use that too. He nodded and locked the phone and set it down on the desk. He would do a deep dive later, pulling out the ones that were most useful. They all would paint a picture, but he wanted a clear narrative. His mind had caught on the fact, though, that from what he'd seen, Gadri hadn't mentioned Joey once. I will, he promised. He grabbed a pen and paper. Whenever you're ready. She straightened her posture, removed her hands from her sleeves, her face a placid mask. The first time he touched me inappropriately was about 3 months into our relationship. We had gone to an event and one of the photographers recognized me. He nodded, so she went on, and then, well, once he noticed me, I guess some of the others did as well. Gadri had been launching something new at the time and apparently really wanted specific questions, and you know what those people are like, so all they were asking me was stupid stuff. I didn't really think anything of it. He hadn't told me. She stopped for a second and repeated. He hadn't told me. When we got back to his house I thought we'd had a nice if not boring night. And he grabbed hold of my upper arm. And sort of, lifted me a little, so that I was on my tiptoes. And the hold wasn't, it was what he was saying that I was focused on at the time. All about how I'd embarrassed myself, how I'd looked desperate and foolish, vain. That people only wanted to talk to me because of who my family was, and how sad it was that all I could talk about was what I was wearing because I didn't have anything else to say. It wasn't until the next day that I even realized how hard he'd gripped me. I couldn't lift anything with that arm for a week. I confronted him about it, and you know it wasn't. I think. I had always expected it to fit a mold, maybe because of my FA, I don't know. He didn't fly into a rage or anything. He didn't beg forgiveness when he saw the bruises. He just got me an ice pack, and joked that he forgot how little I was for a minute, that I bruised like a peach, and then he kissed the top of my head and went to work. He wrote down just the facts. An approximate date. A headline about the abuse. Denotations like verbal and physical. He wrote bruise like a peach and underlined it with deep indentations 3 times. It wasn't like what I'd read about. Ursula told him, after that. You know, a lot of people say that they didn't know when it would happen. That their partner would just fly into a rage one moment about things they wouldn't have cared about in the previous. I always knew when it would happen. After that, I'd be standing in a room, smiling, laughing, and I'd know. Because too many people had complimented me, or I'd lingered too long with my family or a friend. It was, she looked at him apologetically, her voice soft and tender when she explained, it was worse when it was your family. I think he must have known that you all were a threat to him. When I got back from your wedding he deleted every picture I'd taken. He told me it was pathetic. He had to fight to keep his voice under control enough to ask, to take pictures at a wedding. She shrugged. I said something about missing you all. Sangza, things were already bad then, but we'd pretended for the weekend. He said it was pathetic, to cling on to some family that wasn't even mine. That I had a family. It never occurred to me to say, but you never want me to see them either. So, when you had dinner with my dad when he went on a business trip, he suggested, and she nodded. And, didn't Bran stay with you for a week once? She nodded, a tear slipping out of her eye. It was a really good week. And he gave me a tattoo to remember it by. She lifted her hand, showing her palm, and he saw a scar he hadn't noticed. Though it was more like a brand. I had made dinner, and foolishly grabbed this casserole dish out of the oven with only one oven mitt, and it started to teeter, and so I didn't think, and I went to steady it. And I cried out, and Gadri came over, and I thought he was going to take it from me, but he held my hand to it, just for, not that long, really. And he said, see what happens when you do stupid things. He had seen this before. Gadri was clever, so much more detestable than someone who just flew into a blind rage. He waited, calmly, patiently, like a cat watching a bird try to fly away with a broken wing. Tying every bit of violence to something he could make her believe was a mistake of her own. It was worse when it was your family. He was pretty sure that when Bran stayed with her it was the last time any of them saw her until his dad's funeral. I'm sorry, I don't mean to seem, but if I don't keep us on track, he told her. She nodded. I'm asking this to build our case, not for any other reason, okay? That's nice of you to say, she told him, our case. Sorry, yes, I understand. Ask whatever you need to. He said it was pathetic, to cling on to some family that wasn't even mine. Did you ever tell anyone or go to the hospital, he asked. It wasn't what he wanted to ask. He wanted to ask what happened to her when she got back from his wedding. He wanted to ask why she didn't pull him aside, interrupt the ceremony, cause a scene, get their attention. They were useless questions. Insensitive questions. Questions that society needed to do a better job of not asking people who had been through what she had. He knew that. He also knew that they were questions that would corrode him anyway. Once she told him. Her voice had gone cold. Emotionless. Terrifying. I think I mentioned that there was one time that things were a bit worse. He nodded. We got into an argument, a bad one. He took hold of my arm but he shoved me back at the same time. It dislocated my shoulder. And I banged my head. My head was okay. But I was pregnant at the time. With Joey, he asked, his voice a snarl. No, she answered. No. He had thought there could be nothing worse than the idea of him hurting her with Joey growing inside of her. But there was. The idea of Joey not being there at all. I don't know if it was the force of it or the stress she told him, I don't know. Either way it was his fault, he told her. She nodded, unable or unwilling to look at him. When was this? Her eyes flashed to his briefly and he shook his head, no. She didn't answer him, instead she reached into her bag once again and pulled out a folder. He opened it. Wintertown Memorial Hospital, the record said. It was dated just about 3 years earlier. The night of his dad's funeral. I didn't know he was there, he said uselessly, because the silence was ringing so loud he couldn't think enough to say anything else. He didn't come to the funeral, she told him. I knew how Sangza felt about him, I didn't want him to be there. He stayed with Joey at the hotel. He wrote down the facts, not that he would ever forget them. Even if he did, he had the report. The evidence. Will you tell me what happened? He asked. He pushed the pad of paper away. Just me. Can we go over there? She pointed to the L-shaped couch. Maybe like him she also wanted clear lines between the personal and the professional. He nodded and stood up, walking over and pulling back her chair. She stood too and he followed her over to the couch. He sat down first, wanting to let her decide how they were positioned. She sat down next to him, a few inches apart. She turned towards him and slid back slightly, lifting more of her left leg onto the couch. I'm afraid to tell you, she told him. Because I feel like you're going to take it on more than you should. It's kind of your thing. Everyone needs a hobby, he teased gently. She smiled. I'm serious. You're probably right, he admitted, turning towards her, his arm going across the back of the couch behind her. I'll try not to though. When I heard about your dad, I booked a flight that night for me and Joey, she told him. She shook her head. It was like a call to arms, or something. But I talked myself out of it. I insisted on coming for the funeral though. And I told him I was bringing Joey. I think he knew that if we came up here on our own. I had sort of expected something. You know, you all were such a trigger for him. But he's smart. He knew how devastated I was. So he held me and he comforted me. And he reasoned with me. He didn't argue with me about bringing Joey. He just suggested that he come too, to help out with her while I was with you guys. I was grateful. He flew us privately, looked out the window of the airplane with Joey, let me grieve. I told him that I wanted to go to the funeral on my own and he didn't fight me on it. He took Joey to the park. I went to the funeral. And Rakan hugged me. He was so big, she laughed softly. He always had been. But he felt especially so then. And I hadn't seen him for so long, and he's supposed to be the baby. But when he hugged me, I realized how much safer I felt in his arms than Gadri's, even when his were gentle. And I sort of I think had a panic attack or something, about Joey being with Gadri on her own. I didn't. Everyone was talking about how beautiful your eulogy was, but I didn't hear a word of it. I was planning the whole time. What I was going to say and how I was going to do it. I was going to go to the hotel, pack our bags as though we were going to leave. I was going to tell Gadri that I wanted to bring Joey to meet Kitty quickly before we left. And I wasn't going to come back. I think at the time I told myself it was because you all needed me, but I know now it was because I needed you. He saw it all over my face. He said I thought you were smarter than this. And I just lost it. I told him if I was smarter, I never would have been with him in the first place. That I wasn't happy, that I didn't love him. All for one moment of honesty. My child died just so that I could hear myself say it. Your child died because their father is a monster, he corrected her. He remembered the things Roslyn had said to him when they ended things. Vicious, terrible things. The thought to lay his hands on her had never once occurred to him. He didn't need to correct his mind to know that nothing she had said could have made it her fault. Why did you go back? He asked as gently as he was able. His mind couldn't quite let her off the hook for that one. I was so weak, she told him, physically. Mentally, and emotionally too, though. And I didn't have the strength to fight him on my own, and I didn't feel like it was right to ask